minus 40 seconds. T minus 30 seconds. T minus 20 seconds. 15 seconds. 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
Good evening, everyone. How you doing? I'm made aware this morning that tonight there's an important emergency declaration committee that's taking place at the Senate. MPs and Senators will be questioning Justin Trudeau's national security and intelligence advisor, who is Jody Thomas. Who claimed the government didn't need to find a national security threat as per defined in the Emergencies Act, Section 2, to use towards invoking the act. So typically, that's the law that's in place to invoke the Emergency Measures Act. But Jody Thomas, and same with the director of CSIS, Vignon, we know now have made up their own views because of IMVEs or what have you. And they just went away and did it anyways. So I'm actually really looking forward to this. There's some good people that are going to be talking tonight, like Larry Brock, who's a conservative. And he's actually one dude who has spoke up quite a bit since this happened. Let me just pull this up here. Okay. We're still waiting here for a couple minutes, so let's say what's up to some people. Sue, how's it going? Edgar, good evening. Mumsy, Kelly, Demetra, how are you? My day was fantastic. Spent some time at the gym, spent some time with the kids, spent some time with the dogs. Doesn't get much better than that. But this meeting's just about to get underway, so let's go check it out. Hopefully they put some big pressure on.
Should any technical challenges arise, please advise, as we may need to suspend to ensure all members are able to participate. For our first panel this evening, we are joined by Jody Thomas, National Security Intelligence Advisor, Martin Green, Assistant Secretary to the Cabinet, Intelligence Assessment, and Mike McDonald, Assistant Secretary to the Cabinet, Security and Intelligence from the Privy Council Office. We are also joined by Marie-Hélène Sher. Thank you. Executive Director of the Integrated Terrorism Assessment Center. I understand Ms. Thomas will lead with opening remarks. Ms. Thomas, we welcome you and you have 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair.
Hey guys, I got a little bit of an echo, which is fine. I think it's something to do with my audio. I just want to ensure that you guys aren't getting an echo.
Intelligence Advisor on
if you could let me know in the chat.
2022. It is a position designed to provide coordinated, nonpartisan advice to the Prime Minister through the Clerk of the Privy Council. The role includes coordinating the national security and intelligence community, providing a challenge function like all deputy secretaries do at PCO, Conseil à la sécurité nationale et au renseignement supervise 4 secrétariats, le secrétariat de la sécurité,
The NSIA oversees 4 secretariats: Security and Intelligence, Foreign and Defense Policy, International Intelligence Assessment, and the new Emergency Management and COVID.
it could be my French.
This is the interpreter. Are you not hearing the interpretation? Are you not hearing the interpretation?
Okay, I think our interpretation, pardon me, Ms. Thomas. Go
Thank
ahead.
you. Le secrétariat de la politique étrangère et
Intelligence Assessment and the new Emergency Management and COVID-19 Recovery Secretariat, as well as Security and Intelligence.
the national security threat posed by the so-called Freedom Convoy was multifaceted and complex, and we are learning more about it daily. The protests, occupation of the nation's capital, the blockades of critical infrastructure presented unprecedented challenges for government. Freedom of expression and peaceful assembly are fundamental rights and must be protected in any democracy. However, the government has a responsibility to ensure safety and security for Canadians. I want to emphasize that it was the totality of the circumstances that led me and others to recommend invoking the Emergencies Act. It is important to note that these measures were temporary and in place from 14 to 23 February and were carefully tailored to ensure they were reasonable, proportionate, and thankfully short-lived. Others have appeared to provide information and context with regards to the broader implications of the myriad of factors that led to how the Emergencies Act was invoked and carried out. I'm here to speak about the role of the NSIA as a coordinating body within the federal intelligence community, as well as an advisor to the federal government. My colleagues and I look forward to your questions, and I will end there.
Okay, thank you very much. We begin our round of questions, starting with Mr. Motz.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and thank you to the witnesses for being here. Ms. Thomas, I'll focus on you. I appreciate your introduction on your role as the National Security and Intelligence Advisor. You provide briefings, as you said, and advice to the Prime Minister through the PMO. So would it be fair to suggest that an aspect of your responsibility during the Freedom Convoy was to provide the PMO, the Prime Minister, and Cabinet briefings that were with full, frank, and factual threat pictures? Would that be a fair assessment?
Thank you for the question. The information and the intelligence is provided through PCO, not through PMO, just as a clarification. But yes,
Okay.
frank, open, transparent information.
Okay, thank you. Would you then agree with me that the Emergencies Act sets out the threshold upon which government must rely upon to lawfully invoke the Emergencies Act, and namely the definition in Section 2 of the CSIS Act, and that I would suspect you have a firm understanding of Section 2, which defines what threats to security of Canada means?
Yes, and thank you for the question. This has been a subject of significant discussion. It certainly has come up in these hearings, and it came up at the inquiry last week. And legal advice has been provided. And I know that the Deputy Minister of Justice and the Minister of Justice have both been here. The government has a responsibility to take a broad look when assessing national security threats.
I want to get to that.
Okay.
So CSIS, the RCMP, the OPP have testified that there was an intelligence to support that a threat to the security of Canada existed. And yet, as you've just stated now, and you stated at the commission, that you received some legal opinion that included a broader interpretation, as you've just indicated, of the Emergencies Act than what the law states is the prescribed threshold. So can you tell me who determined that this broader interpretation was required? Is the first part of that. When was that interpretation asked for? Who wrote that interpretation? And when was that interpretation received by you or others, and that you presented it?
So thank you very much for the question. The Department of Justice wrote the legal opinion. They write legal opinions for government.
Okay.
The 2C question is significant. The interpretation of 2C and the Emergencies Act is that the national security description and the parameters are assigned the meaning per 2C of the CSIS Act. as opposed to derived directly from. And what that means is that there is not one person in this country who determines something is a national security threat. We do not believe that the drafters of the Emergencies Act intended for the CSIS director to be the sole arbiter of national security threats to this country. It means, as an example, that there could be a policing situation, lawlessness on the streets. The police are overwhelmed. They cannot respond. But if there is not a very narrow 2C threat, then the Emergencies Act couldn't be applied. And we do not believe that that was the intention of the drafters.
Well, I will interrupt you there, Ms. Thomas. Actually, if you listen to the testimony of the person who drafted this, Mr. Beatty, or Mr. Perrin Beatty, he did say that they used Section 2 specifically because of how carefully it was drafted and relied upon. So would you say that this broader interpretation that was relied upon, that you relied upon it and the advice you gave to Cabinet, and was it clear to Cabinet that this interpretation did not align with the letter of the law that's included in the Emergencies Act?
It aligned, thank you for the question. It did align with the letter of the law as interpreted, and yes, Cabinet was thoroughly briefed.
So would you place, I guess my question would be at this stage, why would you place any value on a legal opinion that to me is when the existing law is pretty clear on what you need? Could it be that since the circumstances of the protest didn't really meet the threshold, as had been said already by the RCMP, the OPP, and CSIS intelligence, that it was conscripted to try and justify the government's invocation of the Emergencies Act?
Thank you very much for the question. No, I don't agree with that.
Okay, thank you very much.
Minutes is up. Thank you, Mr. Motz. I'll move to Mr. Nakvi.
Thank you very much, Chair, and welcome to all the panel members. Thank you, Ms. Thomas, for being here. And I'm just going to perhaps continue the line of questioning where Mr. Motz left. You told the Public Order Emergency Commission that, and I quote, "In terms of the Emergency Act, the Governing Council can consider more broadly than the intelligence collected by CSIS in determining a national security threat or situation, the national security threat or situation or a public order emergency," end of quote. And you were alluding to that just right now in your comments as well. What did you mean by that? If you can take some time to explain that to us, and why is that important in the context of a public order emergency?
Thank you very much for the question. What I meant by that is that the 2C national security definition is not a one-for-one translation into the Emergency Act. It is assigned meaning from the CSIS Act, as opposed to it must be determined by CSIS. And Section 16 of the Emergencies Act requires a broad interpretation and allows for a broad consideration. And the Governor and Council has that responsibility. And so the totality of the events across the country were determined to meet a threshold for a public order emergency. There were blockades at, as we know, the Ambassador Bridge, Emerson, Coots, Surrey. There were convoys being formed across the country. As the Ambassador Bridge was being cleared, we learned of pop-ups to retake that bridge. In fact, the police had to stay in place for quite a significant amount of time. The threat of weapons in Coots, and then the discovery of the size of the cache, and then even news that we heard today about the significance of that cache, and then amount of ammunition that was collected there. And then hearing the same language being used about Ottawa, that there was a threat of weapons. The economic impacts, the inability of Canadians to live their lives, and the increasing rhetoric online. And the concern about the rhetoric online, as you've all heard, because you've heard about IMVE, ideologically motivated extremism, is that the leaders of those movements are not necessarily the people who are going to act. It is people who are motivated and inspired to act by the rhetoric they read. The rhetoric was increasing and we were getting concerned. The threats against public officials were increasing and we were getting concerned. And we were in the third weekend going into the fourth weekend. And so the decision was based on the totality and the Section 17 interpretation of a broad view, and the governor and council took the decision that the Emergencies Act was the correct course of action.
So what I'm hearing from you, that when that determination is being made, and you speak of the totality of events that you took into account, there's a contextual nature to that determination and the basis of your advice to PCO and to the Prime Minister, whether the threshold is met or not. Am I correct?
Yes, thank you for the question. Yes, you're correct. CSIS is an intelligence agency. They collect intelligence. 2C allows them to collect intelligence. It doesn't allow us to necessarily act, and it doesn't mean that there will be a police action as a result of 2C. And so the broad interpretation, the context, the national nature, and the amount of time that this had been going on, and the dire concerns coming out of Coots led to the action taken.
So when we look at your recommendation to the Prime Minister, when we look at the recommendation of Mr. David Vigneault, the CSIS director, and I believe he told the commission that based on both his understanding that the Emergencies Act definition of threat to the security of Canada was broader than the CSIS Act, as well as based on his opinion of everything he had seen to that point, he advised the Prime Minister of his belief that it was indeed required to invoke the Act. So even the CSIS director, as I read it and understand it, agrees with your understanding of the importance of context. I'm asking you not on his behalf, but it's your understanding that his advice to invoke the Act was also based on the context that he was seeing in his role as a CSIS director as to what was happening, not only just in Ottawa, but across the country, and how it was escalating by the moment?
Thank you very much for that question. I can't speak for the CSIS director, but as a senior deputy minister in the national security community, yes, I believe that is the perspective he had.
That's up.
Thank you.
We'll move to Mr. Fortin.
Merci.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'll continue. Ms. Thomas, you're sort of our star witness tonight. Madam Thomas, based on your testimony, I gather that what motivated you to believe that a threshold had been met was the blockade of the Ambassador Bridge and others, the fact that there was a convoy heading towards Ottawa, the fact that these individuals had obtained a lot of funding. We're talking millions of dollars. What's the exact figure? Do you actually know how much money, to your knowledge, had they collected?
It was in excess of $20 million. The exact number, I think, was revealed during the inquiry.
Mais à ce moment-là,
But when you were recommending, at the moment when you actually recommended the declaration of emergency, there were 20 million or so?
Thank you for the question. We knew there was in excess of 10 million.
Okay. And these are the reasons why you believe there was a reason to proclaim the Emergency Measures Act. Is that correct?
It was, as I've said, the number of blockades, the number of people who were coming to join the Ottawa blockade and occupation, the concern about weapons, the rhetoric, the IMV actors who were in the mix, and the connection between all of those entities. Yes, the totality of it.
mais est-ce que
But were there no other means to face the situation?
par exemple,
For instance, those trucks that were blocking Wellington Street, they could have been towed. I mean, they did end up getting towed. The protesters were pushed back by police officers that got involved. Were there no other measures based on applicable legislation that could have been used?
Thank you very much for that question. I think what you've raised some very important points. Number one, tow trucks were a problem in a multiple locations. Tow truck drivers were either intimidated, or we've learned paid not to participate, not to provide service. We looked as far as Montreal to get tow truck drivers to come to Ottawa as but one example. And so we had a national tow truck strategy, which I know that the Deputy Minister of Transport Canada has explained to you. Tow trucks were a major issue, and we're talking about big rigs. We're not talking about the average tow truck. That equipment, hard to find, and we had to compel tow truck drivers to come to respond. Other measures, we had 2 tracks of action that we were looking into that Mike McDonald led on behalf of PCO with public safety. Track 1, track 2, you've heard that talked about. Track 1 was existing legislation and what could be used within existing legislation, provincial, municipal, and federal, to resolve the situation. At the end of weekend 3, none of it was working. We could not gain traction with the province in Ontario. And the city, the police chief said there was no policing solution. You've heard that testimony.
Mais monsieur,
But you're referring to the chief of police. Sorry, I don't want to interrupt you, but you understand I have a limited time. The chief of police said he wanted 1,800 police officers to free up the downtown core. In the end, he received 2,000 or so after he actually stepped down. From what I gathered, the tow trucks under the Highway Traffic Act of Ontario, you could actually require them to be, you compel them to be used. And if they didn't want to do this, you could have had an injunction to force them into it. Am I mistaken in this?
Ontario, it's an Ontario Act, and Ontario did not compel the tow truck drivers. We used the federal act to do that. There were many opportunities.
vous avez utilisé
You used the federal act, I understand that, but my question was, could you not have used the legislation in effect, like the Highway Traffic Act of Ontario or the Criminal Code or anything else, to say that doesn't work, you can't do that, we're going to get an injunction, we're going to force people to do certain things? Couldn't you have done that?
Injunctions were discussed there and not used. It is more a private law remedy as described by the department, the Minister of Justice. There were actions that could have been taken under existing legislation, but when they weren't, and we were at the end of the 3rd weekend, the federal government had to act. And you have heard the testimony both at the inquiry and here that there were challenges in getting Ontario to the table to have discussions and use their act. So the federal government doesn't apply provincial legislation, the province does.
Oui, mais
Yes, but you may have heard from Commissioner Lucky, who in one of her testimony said that the available means had not all been used and that before.
merci, Madame Thomas.
Thank you, Madam Thomas.
Mr. Green?
Thank you, Madam Chair, and welcome to our witnesses here today. As you know, we've been at this for the better part of 8 or 9 months, trying to lay the foundation for hopefully what will become recommendations back to the House and the Senate to improve upon the legislation, the definitions, and the thresholds in hopes that we don't find ourselves back in a similar like situation. I'll begin with you, Ms. Thomas, through the chair. Is it your assessment that while the government may, or different levels of government may have had legal remedies available, that the practical collapsing, I'll say for lack of a better term, of policing and the inability of policing to adequately provide law and order, particularly as it relates to the occupation here in Ottawa, did that inform some of your advice to the Privy Council office?
Thank you for the question. When the policing remedies in the city of Ottawa became unavailable, they could not respond. The magnitude of what was going on was beyond their capability. That, yes, certainly after the 3rd weekend was part of the advice.
Is it your assessment that it was the 3rd weekend that they were rendered unavailable? I'll say failed. I'm going to use that language. There was a failure of policing to adequately provide law and order in the nation's capital on Parliament Hill. At what point in your assessment did you believe that to be a risk to national security?
I can't give you an exact day, sir, and so I apologize for that. What I will say is that—
Would you say that it was early on in your assessment? Did you contemplate that and we've seen this in testimony now, the lack of confidence between the RCMP, the OPP, and the OPS, there was some pretty clear testimony that those communications had broken down in many fundamental ways, including operational planning. Would you agree with that there was a breakdown in those communications?
I would agree that certainly there was a breakdown in communication, and that the inability to create an operational plan that was effective and executable was certainly a significant issue.
And why is that?
Why did it happen?
Yeah, I'll let you state plainly why not having police available to use legal remedies that I think, and I'll just put the card on the table, when Mr. Beatty and the drafters of this legislation first were contemplating the Emergency Act, I'm not clear they ever contemplated the failure and breakdown of policing in the way that we watched and observed across the country. Would you agree with that?
I would agree with your assessment of the Emergency Act. Yes, I think that Ottawa being the city of protests, the information, and I use the term information in addition to the word intelligence that was provided and available to police, gave a very mixed message at the beginning. And that,
In that, just to be clear, in that some were saying they were going to leave in a couple days.
Right.
And I think there were some other reports that suggested this was protracted. They had no intention of leaving.
exactly. I think that the police, being used to managing protests in this city, thought they had a plan that would manage this situation. And the magnitude of the number of trucks and how entrenched they became very quickly in the city was underestimated and a consequential issue.
In your opinion, from a threat assessment, how important was it to you to have the knowledge that there were members of Joint Task Force 2, members of the RCMP security detail for the Prime Minister, members of both serving and we're hearing now perhaps with leaks, like active duty police officers and military. When you talk about threats of ideologically motivated violent extremists, how important was it for you to understand that there were people with logistical knowledge and capabilities that would far exceed any typical protest that you might see set up on the lawn of Parliament Hill?
As that information became available, certainly it was a concern.
And when did it become available?
Very early on, the first weekend, as we started to understand who some of the players were, and we saw the supply chains and the logistics that were being built to support the rigs staying in downtown Ottawa.
Yeah, they had a off-site supply station, for lack of a better term, where they could get warm, get fed, get fuel to then come back. And so while this is what I'm challenged with, while that's simultaneously happening, there's internal intelligence that's suggesting these folks are going to wrap it up. So, and when we talk about quality of information and intelligence, where were you drawing on your intelligence from to make your decisions? Was it local, provincial, or national?
Well, thank you for that.
Ms. Thomas, Mr. Green, your time is up.
Well, they're here for 2 hours, Madam Chair, so we'll be fine. We'll come back to that.
Ms. Thomas, if you, Mr. Green,
Madam Senator Boniface, the floor is yours.
would you kindly take a minute or so to answer Mr. Green's question, because mine actually follows on his.
On intelligence sources.
Yeah.
So I have my expert on intelligence here, and I'm going to ask him to step in and beside me, the two. We received intelligence from a number of sources, our own collection through CSIS, but also the OPP's collection, Project Hendon. I didn't know the name of it, but certainly it was available to the intelligence teams. Our own assessment of open source intelligence, and certainly from the RCMP and their INSET teams. But Madame Chaillet.
Thank you very much, Madame Thomas. So yes, as Madame Thomas mentioned, there's several intelligence agencies in town who were looking at this from their own specific mandates. My organization, ITAC, I've had the pleasure of appearing before this committee a few months ago, if you'll remember. Our responsibility is to assess the likelihood of a terrorism attack happening in Canada and overseas. And so we looked at the situation from that perspective, and we shared our assessments, our reports with the broader national security community in Ottawa, but also with our colleagues in other jurisdictions, law enforcement, for instance. And so, as you will have heard before, the National Security Governance met regularly during the events, and each intelligence assessment agency shared their relevant assessments with colleagues.
Thank you. Mr. Green, would you like to add something briefly?
Yeah, I would just briefly add that I think it was during the first week, Mr. Green, when you that there were more and more open source reports with respect to former police, former CAF members. There was one actually who said he was an intelligence officer who evidently worked in my section. But I found out that it was sort of 20 years ago and he was on a short contract. But that was disturbing in terms of, you know, how sophisticated the logistics might be.
And the intelligence.
Yeah, and the intel.
Okay, thank you. And that kind of leads, Ms. Thomas, to some comments you made around the online information that you were picking up. And clearly the act, when it was designed, did not have that in mind 30 some years ago. Can you give us a sense of what that information was that you were picking up online, and how would you assess it in terms of escalation, de-escalation in relation to certain occurrences taking place?
Thank you very much for that question. Madame Chaillet is actually the best place to respond to that.
Absolutely, whoever.
Thank you very much. Yes, so a lot of the IMVE rhetoric is being exchanged, disseminated online, as we all know. And so ever since the beginning of the pandemic, really, we've seen a marked increase in IMVE rhetoric online on social media. And so the challenge with that is that, as Madam Thomas mentioned earlier, the people who actually disseminate the propaganda are not necessarily the people who would actually mobilize to violence and conduct an act of terrorism. What we have seen happening is the consumers of that rhetoric, of that propaganda, slowly or sometimes very quickly radicalizing and mobilizing to violence and then conducting an act of terrorism. And so during the convoy, during the whole pandemic, and still, we're seeing that kind of narrative, very like anti-authority, anti-government, but also xenophobic, misogynistic. And another challenge with the IMV threat that we're facing is that some of my colleagues call it the salad bar threat, because people will not necessarily just focus on one set of grievances. They can pick up many different things depending on their own personal circumstances and get triggered. And it's very hard to determine by what and when and what kind of act of violence they might actually conduct.
Okay, thank you. I have 30 seconds left. In terms of the rhetoric that we see and we continue to hear, as you say, how is it impacted internationally? And I can get the answer at my next question, but I have former colleagues who are working in New Zealand, had great concern about what was going on. And I think all of that context, as an example, is reflective of the environment we're in today versus when at the time the act was written. So I'll just hold that question to the end. I think I'm done.
You are done. Perfect.
Okay, we'll move to Senator Carignan.
Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you, Madam Chair. My questions are for you, Madam Thomas. Can you tell us about the legal opinion that so many people actually have seen, aside from us, to know who asked for that legal opinion as to the option to invoke the Emergency Measures Act?
I think that's a solicitor-client privilege question. The legal opinion is written by the Department of Justice, and there had to be a legal opinion to accompany the invocation document. But beyond that, I don't think I can say much more.
Qui est le client?
Who is the client?
The Governor and Council.
Okay.
Okay. You were aware of this legal opinion?
Aware of legal opinions along the path as the determination was made to invoke the act.
Okay. Monsieur Vigneault?
Mr. Vigneault had knowledge of this.
Vigneault should speak for himself, but I believe that he had his own legal opinion.
À l'extérieur du cabinet?
Outside of cabinet, how many people had access to this legal opinion?
To that question.
Selon vous?
According to you, would several people outside of cabinet have had access to it?
I'm sorry, Madam Chair, I don't know the answer to that question. I wouldn't want to speculate.
Okay.
Okay. So the client is cabinet. The professional who provided the service is the Department of Justice, the Solicitor General. So the cabinet can waive this solicitor client privilege. Were you consulted by cabinet as to waiving this solicitor client privilege for this legal opinion?
I was not consulted. I have not had a discussion on that question.
OK. Et quelle était la nature?
Okay. And on the legal opinion as such, to you, was this a decisive factor in your recommendation?
The understanding of the Emergencies Act and the elements of it, that was critical. My own recommendation was based on the national security community and the information that we had in hand to advise cabinet on February 13th and 14th.
OK.
Okay. What do you think of the fact that in the record that we've seen that you yourself were there in cabinet? We can see the list of all the people that were there in person, including the commissioner for the RCMP. The commissioner wrote an email to the Minister of Public Safety saying that it wasn't really at the point where the Emergency Measures Act needed to be invoked, that there were other means available. When that was discussed in cabinet, the RCMP commissioner never sort of said, hey, I sent you an email, Minister, Public Safety Minister. I mean, did no one say anything to really gain access to that email?
So I certainly am not going to talk about what was discussed in cabinet. And I think that is understood here. That question has been discussed. At the IRG, there's an opportunity for officials to speak. And the commissioner of the RCMP had that opportunity. The reality is that the plan did not come together until February 17th, after the Emergencies Act was invoked, and it was inclusive of elements of authorities that were afforded to police in the Emergencies Act. And so the final plan was not ready until February 17th.
But it had been in planning earlier than that.
We'd been hearing about plans for weeks.
OK. Puis,
Okay. What would you say was the main issue that happened in Ottawa that caused the invocation of the Emergency Measures Act?
Again, thank you for that question. I've been very clear. I believe that it was not one location that caused the invocation of the Emergency Act. It was the totality of the blockades.
oui, mais les autres étaient réglés.
Yeah, but the others had been settled. Windsor, Coots, there was really only Wellington Street with the spa and the jacuzzi and the barbecue.
Well, that's not, thank you for the question. That's not actually true. There were blockades in Surrey. Coots was being cleared. Ambassador Bridge was very tenuously cleared. Peace Bridge, threats against Via Rail lines, intelligence about convoys being created to join and bolster what was going on in Ottawa.
Ms. Thomas, I'm sorry, Senator Carignan, your time is up. And we'll move to Senator Harder.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you, Ms. Thomas and colleagues, for being here. I'd like you to describe to the committee how you formed your view. I'm not asking for what it was, but it's important for us to understand the process that the NCA, National Security Intelligence Advisor, goes through, and to assure us that the advice given is given to the Governor and Council in an unfiltered fashion.
Thank you very much for that question. In this particular circumstance, and it was 3 weeks into my new job, so I'm not—
You're very experienced at
yes.
that point.
What we did was use the community, as is always done in national security events, and is the purpose and the reason why the National Security Advisor was created post 9/11, to ensure comprehensive view of national security threats and defense and foreign policy issues, because each individual agency in the national security community, CSIS, the RCMP, Canadian Forces Intelligence Command, Global Affairs Foreign Intelligence Group, CBSA, many, IRCC has an intelligence group. They all collect or assess intelligence in their very narrow mandates. And so CSIS could see one element of a situation, and the Canadian Armed Forces, if it's foreign intelligence, a completely different perspective. And what we want to do is to ensure that there is a assessed, holistic view of threats, intelligence, and information. And so we use the intelligence assessment group for foreign intelligence. We don't have that capacity in the same manner for domestic intelligence. We rely on assessments done by groups like ITAC and information from the National Security and Intelligence Operations Committee that Michael McDonald chairs, along with public safety, to build an understanding and advice, because intelligent to decision makers. Intelligence is like a data point. It's like economic data. It doesn't tell you what to do. It tells you what might happen. It gives you indications of events that could occur, and it gives you some insight into what is occurring, and you have to make decisions with that information. It never tells you what to do, and it's never a certainty. And so we use all of the elements of the intelligence and national security community to build the information that we will give to government. And I ensure that it is agreed with by the community before it's provided.
And that it is provided in an unfiltered fashion to all the decision makers.
All the decision makers, yes.
And in that search for, in that period of making the assessment, obviously an ongoing one, did you ever receive a call from your American colleagues or counterparts to asking what the heck is going on?
Thank you for that question. It wasn't quite phrased that way, but yes, the Deputy National Security Advisor for Homeland Security in the White House called me to talk about the Ambassador Bridge in particular. Interest in the INVE movement in general, for sure, but a very particular call about the Ambassador Bridge and what could be done to unblock that. At the moment I got the phone call, the auto companies had all called the White House and said, we're laying people off.
So that was a serious call on the part of your American colleague.
Very, very much so, yes.
Madam Chair, do I have time for another question?
Yeah, 1 minute.
Why did it take to the third week? Certainly by the second week, by your earlier testimony, it was obvious that the police failure was not going to self-correct. I was here along with those colleagues who live in Ottawa and represent Ottawa. My constant question to witnesses has been, what took you so long?
It is, thank you for that question. There is a fine balance between acting precipitously and waiting too long. And at going into the end of the third weekend, understanding the time it would take to mobilize police and plan for a police action, for example, in Ottawa, we were going into a fourth weekend if action wasn't taken. And so having tried to use all the existing authorities and levels of government that we could to resolve the situations both in Ottawa and across the country, it was at that point that it was determined we should act. So it is a question of, was it too late or was it too early? And I think that will be debated for quite some time.
Thank you.
Your time is up, Senator Harder. We'll move to Senator Patterson.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and to the witnesses. Ms. Thomas, I'd like to just refer to some of your testimony. You talked about the assessment of a threat to national security as coming from a totality of events, a broad sequence of events. You mentioned threats against public officials. Would you be able to elaborate a little bit on that? What that meant?
Thank you. And I know again that my colleague at ITAC has some information she can also share. We saw an unprecedented number of online threats against the Prime Minister, the Deputy Prime Minister, ministers, local Ottawa politicians of all three levels of government, public officials such as chief medical health officers, federal and provincial. At one point, Dr. Tam had to have close protection because of the threats against her. We'd seen online rhetoric against members of the Prime Minister's office, and they were serious threats. They were credible. And we had not seen that kind of rhetoric in this magnitude and with the kind of vitriolic language that we were experiencing at that time. Now, it had started during the 2021 election and was growing, but we really reached a crescendo with some of the IMVE leaders and then people who are following those movements online, and some in writing, and it was a significant concern.
Et si je puis ajouter à ça,
If I may add to that. So this is a trend that we've been noticing for a few months now. Last summer, you might have noticed a poll led by Le Devoir mentioning that 34% of federal parliamentarians say that they have had death threats against them. So this is a growing trend, and one of the things that concerns me most is that sometimes these threats are sent by email directly or via mail, but sometimes these threats are sent out over social media. So they are broader in their scope in the sense that many people see them, and people start thinking that it is normal or acceptable to make these kinds of statements, issue threats against parliamentarians or senior officials. Whereas some people who put these threats out in social media don't intend to act on them, but these same threats could have an effect on people who consume that kind of rhetoric to take for them to take action. We're privileged not to have had that happen in Canada, but we've seen this actually come to fruition in other jurisdictions.
Chair, if I can just add one more point of context.
I've only got 5 minutes.
The threat environment was such that the RCMP protective services, the parliamentary protective services as well, and the Sergeant at Arms actually changed the way to get into the Hill, and were providing shuttling services by protective policing around the core of Ottawa into the Hill. It got to that level.
Thank you. I'm going to try and get another question in, Madam Chair. The public, I guess, thought that the Ambassador Bridge had been blockade had been stopped when the Emergencies Act was invoked. But you said there was pop-ups to retake that bridge. Could you just, what does that mean?
Thank you very much for the question. What we were seeing was online planning to take the bridge back. And so we had to keep, the province and the city of Windsor had to keep significant police resources on site in order to keep traffic moving. The barricades stayed up for weeks, as an example. And so we were taking everything we read online about potential convoys very seriously. And so when we saw more trucks heading towards Windsor with plans online, it meant that the bridge was not yet a guaranteed, it was not yet guaranteed that the bridge was going to stay open. And so the concern about that is that the trade issue and the economic issue, but it diverted police resources. And there was some significant thought being given that police resources were being diverted deliberately.
Your time is up, Senator Patterson.
Thank you.
Colleagues, we'll move to second round. It's 4 minutes, and we'll start with Mr. Brock.
Thank you, Chair, and good evening, witnesses. Thank you for your attendance. I am primarily going to start with you, Ms. Thomas. I'm going to be delivering a series of rapid fire questions at you. I'll be asking whether you agree with the statement or not. It would elicit a yes or a no. I'm not seeking an explanation. You'd agree with me that this country is bound by the rule of law,
Yes.
that every Canadian, including the Prime Minister, his cabinet,
Senior public servants, and most importantly, the Department of Justice is also bound by the rule of law.
Yes,
And no one, including the Prime Minister, is above that law, correct?
correct.
Now, I'm going to be delivering a series of statements from former Cabinet Minister Perrin Beatty, the chief architect of the Emergencies Act, that this committee should press for any information to help Canadians understand the rationale for invocation and test against both the facts and the deliberately high threshold that is required. Do you believe that?
Yes,
That the Emergencies Act is a blunt instrument because it is used where contingencies can't be managed effectively in any other way. Agree?
the Emergency Act is a charter compliant.
Do you agree?
It's more complex than a yes, no
Thank you.
answer.
That if invoking the act made law enforcement easier, the issue is whether the deliberately high threshold was met, not whether the powers given were useful, or in other words, whether the powers they already had could have resolved the problem. Do you agree with that?
That's how it was used.
That in relation to freezing bank accounts of people associated with the protests, new government powers should be conferred in a time of calm, not by regulation drawn up in a crisis. Do you agree with that?
Yes,
That police were called upon to deal with a breakdown in our political system. Agree?
no,
That if government were to avoid much more serious emergencies in the future, they must restore a civility to our politics that allows us once again to disagree strongly on issues without seeing one another as enemies. Agree?
I'm not a politician.
Do you agree?
I would agree, but I'm not a politician.
Thank you. That our body politic is wounded at the present time. We need to heal those wounds. We need to do it by treating each other as Canadians with respect. We need to do it in such a way that sets aside partisan differences and puts the national interest first. Do you agree with that statement?
Yes,
That the obligation of Parliament at this point is to do everything it can to try and heal the divisions that have been created. Agree?
I'm not a parliamentarian.
Would you agree with me that one of the most important roles of a Prime Minister is to unite Canadians and not divide them by engaging in name calling?
The
Do you
Prime
agree?
Minister should protect Canadians.
Do you agree?
Protect Canadians.
Do you agree that the Prime Minister should not be name calling?
I'm not going to comment on that.
Okay. You are aware at the inquiry, the Prime Minister stated that he did not call people who are unvaccinated names. You aware of that statement?
Yes, I heard that statement.
Would you agree with me that the Prime Minister stated on Quebec television in September 2021 that there are people who are fiercely opposed to vaccination, who do not believe in science, who are misogynistic, often are racist, that there are not many of them, but they take up a lot of space? As a leader, as a country, do we tolerate these people, or do we say, come on? He repeated those same talking points during the unnecessary 2021 federal election. Do you agree that he made those statements?
I did not personally hear those statements, with apologies.
Would you agree with me that either the Prime Minister has a problem, a significant problem with his memory, or he deliberately and intentionally misled the inquiry?
Madam Chair, I don't think that this is fair questioning.
Your time is up.
She can answer the question. It's not up to her, this witness,
Point of
to
order,
question the
Madam
validity
Chair.
and the
We do not
relevancy.
need commentary on the witness's
do I
testimony.
still-
The witness testimony
Can I
stands.
just give her an opportunity to answer?
Thank you.
I'm not sure what the question was.
I
Madam
can
Chair.
repeat the question, Madam Chair. She asked to repeat the question, and with the chair's permission, I would like to repeat the question, Mr. Nakvi. Would you agree with me that either the Prime Minister has a significant problem with his memory, or that he
Madam Chair, I
deliberately
didn't
and
hear a ruling on
intentionally
whether he should
misled?
repeat the question. So can you make a ruling, please, Madam Chair?
I did actually. I told him to go ahead.
And can I repeat the question without being interrupted by the Liberal minister, the Liberal?
Would you kindly proceed so that we can
I will
carry on?
proceed without interruption. Thank you, Chair. Would you agree with me that either the Prime Minister has a significant problem with his memory, or he deliberately and intentionally misled the Rouleau inquiry?
I believe that's a pejorative question. I won't answer it.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Ms. Van Duyn, 4 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And thank you to the witnesses that are appearing before us. I understand that your advice to the federal government on February 13th and 14th was based on the intelligence that you were receiving from various sources. Is that your testimony here today?
Thank you for the question. Intelligence, yes, but also the actions being taken by various departments in the national security and intelligence community to work with their municipal and provincial partners to resolve the situation.
And I thought I understood from Ms. Choyer's testimony earlier that some of the intelligence that you were receiving at ITAC included international terrorist threats that could possibly take advantage of the situation. Is that?
I'm sorry, could you repeat that last part?
Were you concerned about any international threats to Canada at the time, given the lawlessness that was going on?
We actually looked into it, and our concern and what we flagged in our reports is that any violent extremist organization could seize the opportunity afforded by events like that.
And Ms. Thomas, you mentioned earlier this evening the frankly shocking discovery. The Globe and Mail reported that newly unsealed court documents related to the conspiracy to murder RCMP officers in Coutts show that investigators found 2 pipe bombs along with 36,098 rounds of ammunition, gas masks, and firearms. Thankfully, these pipe bombs were dismantled by an explosives team. I also note that the CBC reporting has said that one text message cited by police shows that the bosses told the men to spread the message that the real goal for the protest included altering Canada's political, judicial, and medical systems. It seems that you are aware of this information. You also mentioned that you were very concerned about the situation at Coutts. Is there anything that you would like or can add to the reporting that came out today?
Thank you very much for the question. Other than the magnitude of it and the size and the intentions, the behind the scene intentions confirmed that are now public, confirm what we believed, I don't have anything to add. The determination to overthrow the government, whether here or use force in Coutts, use public dissent to have the government change public policy, change health policy, or change the government, was an underlying motivation of the convoys.
Thank you. I thought I heard you earlier state that having tried to use all of the existing tools and authorities, and by the third weekend of this protest, it was your determination that the federal government needed to step in. So is your testimony tonight that based on the intelligence you had, all existing authorities and tools had been tried up to that point unsuccessfully?
Thank you for that question. I can't say they've been tried because there was opportunities to use provincial legislation and it wasn't used by the province.
And you said that you could not gain traction with the province.
Yes, that's correct.
Thank you. You also spoke about your call with the Deputy NSA for Homeland Security in the United States. Are you aware of these? You described the seriousness of the call. To your knowledge, has any such call ever been made by our American counterpart? And can you tell us a little bit more about the seriousness of that interaction?
Thank you.
And your time is up. I'm wondering if she could just answer yes or no and then maybe pick it up on the next round.
I think we should allow the witness to answer.
That's what I said. Thanks.
Okay. Well, not necessarily yes or no, but an answer.
The conversations with the White House, with the National Security Advisor, with the entire intelligence apparatus in the United States is constant. My colleagues here at the table talk to their counterparts all the time. For me, this soon into my job, to have a call saying, we need to fix this, I need to talk to you right away with a person I'd not yet met, was a bit unusual. It was a very collaborative call. And our American colleagues wanted to do whatever they could to assist us because the economies are so joint.
I think that's sufficient. Thank you. Mr. Fortin, 3 minutes.
Merci.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Madam Thomas, you say that you were in constant communications with your and counterparts in the US. But in Ontario, you said that there had been, or that the means that could have been used weren't used. Did you discuss the matter with your colleague, your counterpart? I can't find the word in French. Your colleague in Ontario responsible for public safety. Did you discuss him and say with him to say what should we do with Wellington Street? Did you have those discussions?
Thank you very much for the question. We had what we called tripartite calls and tables through all the various departments who were trying to take action. So through public safety, through Transport Canada, with the policing agencies. And we tried, you've seen the testimony from the province. We did try. We were accused of trying to dump the problem onto Ontario. We were trying to work with Ontario. Ottawa is not the District of
Mais avez-vous
Columbia.
parlé avec votre...
But did you talk to your counterpart?
Bon, OK. Et dites-moi, vous...
So tell me, you saw, just as I did, that the barricades on Wellington Street were removed by the 2,000 police officers that did end up in town. In your recommendations to the Prime Minister, did you not say at some point, say, you should send the police officers to Ottawa, quite simply, as ended up being done to free up Wellington Street? Did you make that recommendation?
Thank you for that question. The Ontario Police Act is how police are managed within Ontario. And so the Ottawa Police Service makes the request to the OPP.
Je m'excuse, madame.
I'm sorry. I don't want to interrupt. I'm very impolite and I apologize for that, but I have a minute left. Did you recommend to the Prime Minister that he intervene so that police officers come to Ottawa? In other words, that he asked the other premiers to send police officers here. Did you make that recommendation for that police operation to come and free up Wellington Street?
I did not make that recommendation, no.
Et pourquoi?
And why not?
That was done through the policing channels with the RCMP commissioner, who is our liaison into police. The Prime Minister doesn't direct another level of government to send police to a certain location.
Mais est-ce que...
But would that not have been a simpler solution? More respectful, shall we say, than to invoke the Emergency Measures Act?
Thank you. Again, it's more complex than that. The police had been sent to assist in Ottawa. They needed a plan to execute. And every discussion came down to, how are you going to use the police officers? What are they going to be used to do? What is your tactical and strategic plan? And we were using the RCMP commissioner as our lead on that.
Mr. Fortin, I'm sorry, your time is
Merci.
up. We'll have another round. Mr. Green.
Thank you very much. I'm going to put my questions through to Ms. Chaillet. Is that correct? We know through a Guardian report that in the lead up to the occupation that ITAC made a recommendation or reported to the government that there was likely going to be elements of ideologically motivated violent extremists. Is that correct?
We noted in our report that it was a likelihood that they would be there. ITAC doesn't do recommendation, however,
Sure.
which is assessment.
Did you note them? Was it provided to you through security reports and intelligence that they were active and a part of the movement that was descending on the nation's capital?
No, the report that you're referring to, I believe, was an unclassified report, a report that we share with police of jurisdiction that
Sure.
is based on open source. And so it was based on information that we saw in open source.
So given the reports of the discovery today that this Coots armed militia likes, for lack of a better, well, I'll put it to you, this group that originally was a few lone wolves now had other people involved. Was that part of your assessment? Were you aware of any ongoing investigations into this group planning to engage in this way in the lead up to the occupation?
I am not at liberty to discuss this issue.
Is it something
here.
that you'd prefer for us to go on camera for?
No, I think it has to do with the level of classification of those details. What I would say, though, is that, my job is to assess the likelihood of a terrorist
The question I
event.
had put to you through you, Madam Speaker, Madam Chair, is were you aware that there was an armed terror cell organizing with the direct threat to the RCMP concurrent with and it infiltrated into the occupation and the convoy movement?
So what I can say, Madam Chair, is that we were not aware of the details of the police operations.
Were you aware of the details of the organizing through open source? I would imagine, much of this organizing is happening online. Given all of the national security inputs that you had, you either knew or you didn't. If you knew, you advised them. If you didn't, would you not consider that a failure of national security, that we wouldn't know that they were organizing in this way?
I believe that I mentioned that. Okay, so let me rephrase. National security is a very broad topic.
It's
So
a question
I
of, did you know?
and I believe I answered the question.
Okay,
but I
I'm going to
would-
put this last question. I have
If
30
I
seconds
may.
left. The notes that you have prepared today, would you be willing to submit these notes to committee in preparation for this? I'm assuming you brought notes in preparation that you would, if asked questions, refer to for the consideration of this committee. I'm going to ask all witnesses if they would submit their notes to the committee for the purpose of our analysts and our future reporting.
Yes, my notes will be
Just to
shared.
be clear, was that no?
Yeah, well, there's documents here that I don't think I'm at liberty to share.
Are you aware of the duty of candor, sir?
Yes.
Are you aware that that extends to the House of Commons in terms of being a grand inquisitor of the land and us having the complete ability to send for documents and otherwise? Are you aware of that?
Mr. Green, your
Yes.
time is up.
Is a point of order,
Yeah.
Madam Chair? Madam Chair, this is an ongoing issue that we have at this committee, and I'm not sure, given all of the knowledge that we have here, whether they're being advised to obstruct this committee or cooperate with this committee. But we were struck with a mandate that swore us in, that gives us the ability to go in camera. And I would just put through you to the witnesses that we could go about this in a voluntary way, or we could start to deal with motions at this committee that would demand for the documents, refusal of which would be, in my opinion, considered obstruction of this committee. So I just want to make sure the members that are present here tonight understand the seriousness of this committee and the powers and parliamentary privileges that we have as MPs.
Madam Chair, my binder will absolutely be shared. We will share documents and we'll work with the committee clerk on any redactions because of TS level material. Or there should be no TS level material here or secret level material, but we will certainly share our information.
Okay, thank you.
What point of order, Madam Chair?
Go ahead.
I'm just curious to know whether the clerks were able to send the notice that we agreed to last week to these witnesses before they, the cautionary notice that we were give them prior to their appearance today. That's all.
Clerk's indicating yes.
Thank you.
Thank you. We'll now move to Senator, starting with Senator Kieran, going to be followed by Senator Harder. 3 minutes.
Merci.
Thank you. My questions are for Ms. Thomas, Madam Thomas. You're the Prime Minister's advisor for national security intelligence. Where do you get your information from, the basic information that you need in order to provide advice?
Thank you for that question. So Privy Council Office is a consumer of intelligence. We don't collect intelligence. We receive raw intelligence and some assessed intelligence from the national security community. The departments I listed earlier, CSIS, CSE, Global Affairs Canada, Canadian Forces Intelligence Command.
GRC.
RCMP.
Absolutely. And some of it is assessed, some of it is raw. Mr. Green's group does, for foreign intelligence, assessment of all of that to provide a holistic view of the intelligence and what it could potentially mean.
Et vous, vous avez accès à tout.
And you have access to all of that.
Et quand la dernière
When's the last time you would have spoken to the RCMP commissioner? Prior to the 14th, February 14th.
We spoke, thank you for that question. We spoke multiple times every day.
Donc,
So multiple times every day in the days prior to the 14th.
Yes, so there, we, I think, have provided information about the timelines and the days we had meetings and the kinds of meetings we had. So the RCMP commissioner was at what we call DMOC, the Deputy Minister's Operations Committee. There were private conversation, one-on-one
Donc, vous êtes toujours
conversations.
avec elle.
So you're always discussing things with her. Did you ask her if she had a plan?
It was not her plan because the RCMP at that point in time, the OPS was the police of jurisdiction. So it was not her plan. She was reporting on the planning efforts by the planning cell of the 3 levels of the policing
OK.
units.
Est-ce que
Okay, did she tell you or did you ask the question, are there any other means other than to invoke the Emergency Measures Act? Did you ask that question specifically of Ms. Lucky?
Not ask the commissioner of the RCMP that question
Pourquoi?
specifically.
Why not?
Because we were having continual conversations regarding the 2 tracks of work. Track 1 being existing legislation, track 2 being new authorities. And
Okay.
so if there were powers yet expended, the way the committee is structured, people put their opinions on the table.
J'ai entendu le
I heard the Prime Minister testify before the Rouleau Commission, and he said we were looking for a way to do more. Did you get the feeling that the Prime Minister wanted to do more?
Thank you for that question. I can't speculate as to what the Prime Minister was thinking when he answered that question. The Prime Minister wanted the convoys across the country and the blockades to end. That was the
Okay.
question every day. How does
Okay.
this end?
Senator Carignan, your time is up. Senator Harder.
Very much, Chair. Thank you again to the witnesses for your candor. I want to talk a bit about the post-revocation work that you are doing. I'm particularly concerned that the lessons learned from this are in fact incorporated in the way you are working. So a couple of questions. One is the focus on IMVE more prominent as a result of this experience? Is there work underway? There's an announcement a couple of weeks ago that they're going to have a celebration of the event in February. Is there work that you are aware of to ensure a better intelligence gathering to assess that? And is there ongoing work with our American colleagues because of the concerns for the economic well-being of trade routes and bridges in particular that are at a heightened level of regular now engagement? So if you could describe a little bit about, I wouldn't say lessons learned at this point, but a heightened operational awareness.
Thank you very much for that question. And I think Mr. McDonald would be very useful as he chairs the ADMs who do, as you know, Senator, the majority of this kind of work. We are absolutely learning from what has occurred and trying to ensure that we have incorporated where we saw deficiencies as we go forward. So Freedom Convoy 2023 has been mentioned here today. Mr. McDonald's already chaired meetings to start looking at how we're going to respond. DMs will be meeting for the first time about it this week. Our two biggest issues coming out of this, one, IMDE, Madame Chaillet has spoken to that, but it's also understanding when in a legal framework, in a free speech environment, how we understand open source domestic intelligence. And that's a big issue. You can't just sit on Twitter and understand what's going on. You need to use tools, artificial intelligence, those kinds of things, looking for keywords, logarithms to help you understand what's happening. But you need a legal framework to do that, because even though Twitter is public, there are still rights to privacy according to the privacy laws of this country. And so understanding the information and the trends that's out there without associating it to individuals who are not persons of interest, law enforcement or intelligence agencies, is a big complex issue. And it's something that we are focusing a significant amount of work on, but we don't yet have an answer to.
Chair, I'll be very quick in respect for time. There was an opportunity to actually put in place and think about how the governance worked and how we responded as a community, because there was the Rolling Thunder that occurred in April, and there was Canada Day, which is a massive gathering. And a lot of the lessons and some of the ideas were put into the governance and decision structures there. I think I would highlight one very important thing is that I have a deeper relationship with the Ottawa Police. and directly sit and talk with them about these issues. And that really didn't happen before. Also, with Intersect, when in the National Capital Region, and this is only Ottawa specific, there's conversations around what is the future of Intersect? What could it be? How could it expand more? How can it share? How can it cooperate more? So
Mr.
there
McDonald, I'm
have
going to
been
have to
things.
cut you there. We've gone over, but thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, colleagues, we'll now move to 5-minute rounds. If my notes are correct, are you beginning with Mr. Brock?
Madam Chair, would this be an appropriate time for a health break, or would you prefer?
Which are the wishes of the committee? We can take 5 minutes. Sure.
Thank you.
Let's just.
What's going on, guys? Break time. 5 minutes. Yeah, I just decided earlier today that I was going to throw this up and we can all check it out. I'm like, why not? I didn't even know what was going on. But one interesting thing, I don't know if you guys recall this, but when Jody Thomas took the stand at the Public Order Emergency Commission, there were some documents that came out after the day after she testified. And that's when Brendan Miller went up to the stand and he started saying to Justice Rouleau, you know, had I seen these documents yesterday and they were redacted, there's other questions that I would have put to Jody Thomas. Because in those notes, Jody Thomas wrote that it was of her opinion that this convoy did not meet the threat of a national security threat. And that's in documentation. And all of these members of parliament who are around this table and people from the Senate, I'm wondering if they even know this part that happened, because it was a development that Brendan Miller made right towards the last few days of the commission. And we'll probably know the next roundabout here they go. So the first time they went, it's 2 minutes. That's why they're asking for the break right now, because now it'll get a little bit more heated, because the people asking the questions, they get 5 minutes now. And, you know, it's good to see that one dude that was just up there. I can't believe I can't think of his name right now, but he's a member of parliament and he's a member of the New Democratic Party. And he actually puts a lot of heat on this corruption and what these people do. I have the smallest, tiniest, very tiny amount of respect for him. Man, that's hard to say. Green. Shannon, you just nailed it. Yep. Green. That's him. Michael Green. That's right. Thanks, Peter. He's not good, but Matt Green, Karen says, I think you're right, Matt. That's right. Yeah, and he is from Hamilton because he's close to me. That's right. But for an NDP, like, at least he's kind of getting involved. Like, that was a good one when he just put it to the panel. Like, will you be willing to submit your documents that you came in with? Because if you're not willing to do that, clearly you have something to hide. So, I mean, that's why I'm on here. And I think for way too long, we all didn't give a shit and we didn't pay attention to this. And we can't do that anymore. So the media is not going to put this juicy stuff out there. So I don't know. I'm diving into it. I'm clipping it. I'm screen recording it. And I'm getting it out there. Because this is not the world I want for my kids. That's for damn sure. Jessica Martin says it's time to start growing our own food, learning about the land, and using cash all the time. I agree. Carrie says, I was never a political person. Just started watching for my kiddos too. Good. Yeah, it's crazy, guys. If you ever see like the CPAC recording on YouTube, sometimes it's on there. You can jump on during the day and there will be like I don't know, like 100 people on there. Sometimes I've been on where there's like 60 and it's like, this is crazy. There's 60 people in our country watching this right now. And I mean, not that it's that interesting, but it just shows how we don't care. Oh, the pipple's up. Okay, guys, I'm out.
Absolutely. Maybe the same answers. Who knows? You would agree that when it comes to determining whether the government was really acting as a last resort, because no other law would do, it's the Prime Minister's own explanation that matters.
No, it's broader than that.
Would you agree that the government's own legal interpretation of those things that can only be evaluated according to the Prime Minister's testimony because all the legal opinions have not been released?
You'll have to ask that again. I'm sorry.
Justice Rouleau, in his opening remarks at the inquiry, stated that uncovering the truth is the most important goal. When difficult events occur that impact the lives of Canadians, the public has a right to know what happened. Recall that?
I do.
The Prime Minister promised Canadians when first elected in 2015 that they would see the most open and transparent government ever seen. Yet this inquiry has seen hundreds upon hundreds of redacted pages from the government with little explanation as to the legal basis for such exclusion. Would you agree that the actions of the Prime Minister and cabinet ministers who have testified at the inquiry have frustrated numerous lawyers in their ability to drill down to the truth as to the legal basis for the invocation of the act?
I think that the Prime Minister and ministers being
You
on
agree
the
or not?
stand was extraordinarily transparent.
Do you agree?
I do
Madam
not
Chair, the
agree.
witness should
Thank
be
you.
allowed to answer the question.
Inquiry lawyer Gordon Campbell stated, we have from the beginning of this proceeding through till now attempted to find a way to lift the veil that has made such a black box of what has turned out to be a central issue before the hearing. We just regret that it ends up being an absence of transparency on the part of the government. Do you recall that statement?
Not specifically, no.
Do you agree that Justice Minister Lametti testified at the inquiry that the government didn't use the legal definition within the Emergencies Act, but rather used their own reasons, but could not release it due to solicitor and client privilege? You're aware of that?
I did not see all of Minister Lametti's testimony.
You're aware that no government official, all the ministers and the Prime Minister, are talking about solicitor and client privilege as a basis for not releasing those legal opinions. You're certainly aware of that.
Solicitor client
Thank you.
privilege.
Justice Rouleau pressed Minister Lametti on this issue, asking how he would understand and pass judgment on the legal basis for invoking the Emergencies Act, which is a central issue in the commission, when the government was not forthcoming on the legal rationale. He then said, quote, "I guess the answer is we just assume they acted in good faith in application of whatever they were told." Last question. Do you agree with me that the government response of just trust us, we acted in good faith when invoking the Emergencies Act is the complete opposite of being open and transparent with Justice Rouleau, but most importantly with Canadians? Do you agree with that statement or not?
Solicitor client privilege is a long-standing protocol.
Do you agree with that statement, ma'am?
Solicitor client privilege.
Do you agree, yes or no?
I'm not answering that.
Thank you. I cede the rest of my time to my colleague.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and to my colleague, and just to the ITAC. Would you agree that, contrary to the suggestions from Ms. Bendayan, that there are individuals and groups that attach themselves to a protest and try to use that protest for their own ideological purpose? Would you agree with that statement? The suggestion has been made by Ms. Bendayan that the people in Coots were somehow protesters, but they were not. The RCMP has confirmed that.
Madam Chair, I never made such a suggestion.
Oh, you did. Anyway, Madam Chair, I'd like to take this opportunity for the time that I have left and beyond to move the motion that was circulated to the committee, and I will just advise that the intent is to briefly explain what it is for those who may not know, and to adjourn the debate on that until at a time next meeting.
Point of order. So I want to be clear through you, Madam Chair, procedurally, that the Mr. Motz is using his time, or is taking this time for the intervention to table or give notice, because if I'm correct, the correct amount of notice time prior to the meeting did not elapse, and therefore procedurally he can't table it and then adjourn it. Those are different things. Providing a notice verbally is one thing. Tabling it and adjourning it is another.
Mr. Motz, I believe that the proper terminology would be just to give notice. I thought that's what we had.
Okay, fair enough. I will give notice that we will table this motion, and here's the idea behind it. This
Mr.
committee-
Motz, I just, I'll stop. I just want to inform you of about 25 seconds left.
Yeah, but this is not part of my intervention. This is the moving of a motion.
It's oh, okay. Pardon me then. I thought it was. Go ahead.
Thank you. An area of significant discussion that we've had in this committee has been whether the necessary threshold for the government to declare a public order emergency under the Emergencies Act has actually been satisfied. So the matter of the interpretation of those thresholds, including especially the so-called
Madam
CSIS
Chair,
Act
just on a point
threshold-
of order, I'm not. I believe Mr. Motz is explaining the rationale behind the
Briefly,
notice that he's
yes.
giving us.
Yes.
He's meant to be doing that during the remaining portion of his questioning time, which is apparently 25 seconds, according to what you just said.
I'm informed that it doesn't count in your question time, but I'm wondering, Mr. Motz, if you can make it as brief as possible since a notice of motion.
Absolutely. I'd be done already had we not been interrupted so often, Madam Chair. The matter of the interpretation of these thresholds, including especially the so-called CSIS Act threshold, about what constitutes a threat to the security of Canada has lately become a central issue in the proceedings before the Public Order Emergency Commission. We will all recall that when the Attorney General was here of Canada, appeared before a committee on April 26th, he insisted upon solicitor-client privilege when questioned about these thresholds. In face of this claim on May 31st, our committee ordered the production of all legal opinions upon which the government determined.
No consequence to the witnesses before us. If he has a question for the witnesses.
Mr. Motz, can you wrap up the notice of motion, please? We can
Yes.
debate it next week.
I'm not debating it. I'm just simply introducing the motion or this particular motion that's going to be before us next week for those who might not understand what it is we're asking for. Transparency to Canadians is what I'm after here. Obviously, those who are opposed to this
Can
aren't
we-
anxious about transparency.
I appreciate.
Um,
What would you continue?
Thank
please?
you. Evidence heard in the last few days of the commission has made it clear that the government adopted for itself a broader interpretation of the CSIS Act threshold than CSIS itself employs to justify declaring a national emergency. The director of CSIS confirmed that this was done on the strength of a legal opinion prepared by the Department of Justice. The commission's efforts to probe these issues further has been repeatedly stonewalled by the government.
Madam
Commission
Chair, I
counsel,
believe
Mr.
he's
Cameron,
simply
remarked-
reading from a cover letter that he distributed to all of us. We've all got that letter. So if
This
that's
is-
the
this-
notice, then we don't need to be listening to this. We've got it.
It's not to you, Mr. Nakvi.
Then it can be discussed next week as we
Mr.
just
Varani?
agreed, Madam Chair. This is absolutely unacceptable.
Mr. Motz, can I just ask you to wrap up? I think you've got a fair bit on the record already.
Our committee is uniquely positioned to assist to get answers for both the commission and Canadians, and the law of parliamentary privilege possessing a constitutional nature. Our committee and the House power
Madam
supersedes
Chair,
statutory law.
If you
and
have
other
made a
privileges.
ruling,
As
then it
such,
could be challenged, and I so challenge that ruling, Madam Chair. I do not understand what is happening to this committee. Reading a two-page letter into the record does not constitute a notice of motion.
Mr. Motz,
I
you're
have one more
finished?
thing. With the commission's report being tabled in
Asking
less
you
than a
to
month.
finish?
Pardon me?
I'm asking you to finish there.
Yes. Yes.
Okay, thank you.
I'm done.
Yes. I believe you've covered it. Thank you. Okay, well, Miss, 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Ms. Thomas, I'm going to start with you. Obviously, there's a definition in the CSIS Act about threats to the security of Canada. And in subsection C of that definition, it talks about activities within or relating to Canada directed toward or in support of the threat or the use of acts of serious violence against persons or property for the purposes of achieving a political objective within Canada or foreign state. There's also a few other categories. You're aware of that definition?
I am.
Yeah, and Ms. Thomas, you testified in front of the public order inquiry before Justice Rouleau, and obviously you were subjected to cross-examination by a number of different counsel. The Government of Canada Council at one point asked you some questions regarding your understanding of the perceived aims of some of the protesters, and you responded that you understood that there were various aims, but they included the aim of the removal of the Prime Minister. Do you recollect that testimony?
I do.
You stand by that testimony?
I do.
And Ms. Bendayan took you to some articles that were recently unearthed, given that a search warrant was unsealed in, I believe, the Superior Court in Lethbridge, Alberta. And some of what was unearthed in that when that search warrant was opened was that the leadership team about who was orchestrating the Coutts blockade talked about, quote, the elimination of the professional political class. That was one of the quotes. And it also had information about the real goal for the protest being including altering Canada's political, judicial, and medical systems. You're aware of that information?
I am now.
You are now. And we know that Coutts was cleared on or about February 13th, February 14th. Once Coutts was cleared, was your understanding that the threat was over at the Coutts border, or did you have a sense that threats continue to exist there or in other parts of the country?
Thank you for the question. When the Coutts situation was cleared, because of the weapons found, we were relatively certain that Coutts would remain clear. However, we were uncertain and certainly had knowledge that Ottawa was far from clear, and we were starting to hear the same language: weapons in the rigs, weapons in Ottawa, knowledge of weapons. And that was the same language for police protection of the criticality of that investigation. The police were keeping it very close hold, which I completely understand and respect. So when we were hearing the same language about Ottawa, it would have been negligent not to make the same presumptions about the potential of weapons in Ottawa.
And what would you say with respect to border blockades in places like Manitoba, British Columbia, et cetera?
We were getting increasingly concerned about British Columbia on the evening of the 13th. A vehicle ran through the border. So there was, on any given day, activity in a different location that was causing concern. And again, the continual flow of intelligence in that pop-ups were being formed to go support from the island to go to Surrey, from BC to drive across the country and bolster Ottawa. And so the movement was, in fact, despite what had happened at Coots, growing, not diminishing.
And that's after the invocation of the Emergencies Act.
That was before the invocation.
But your sense of the threats continued.
Continued, yes.
And your job as National Security Advisor, I'm sorry to ask you such a trite question, but you provide advice to the Prime Minister and to the Cabinet with respect to security threats.
I provide advice and information.
And this threat and this perceived threat from your perspective would have informed your advice to the Prime Minister when you were asked pointedly about whether the invocation of the Emergencies Act should occur.
Yes.
And can I ask you about, you also testified at the same inquiry before Justice Rouleau with respect to the definition, and I think this was to the Canadian Civil Liberties Act Council. I know there's many council asking you questions, but I believe you noted that the definition of national security needed to be modernized to reflect the nature of modern threats, and that different threats may not meet the current Section 2 definition. Can you expand upon what you're getting at in that response?
When the Emergencies Act was written, the presumption and of threat and the understanding of threat at that time was something manifesting probably overseas as a threat against Canada. Hopefully never to the extent of, but more along the lines of what we saw on 9/11, rather than what we saw on January 6th. And January 6th, that kind of domestic threat that is movement rather than a structured organization with command and control, which is what terrorist cells, for lack of a better term, used to have, was a command and control situation where people were given their tasks and they went and executed them. The IMVE movements are exactly as had been described by my colleagues here today. They are people with views, generally awful, but lawful, as CSIS says, who can use the social media to bring other people into those views using misinformation and disinformation, and that motivates people to act. There have been...
Ms. Thomas, I'm sorry, Mr. Brownie, your time is up.
Thank you, Ms. Thomas.
Mr. Fortin, 5 minutes.
Merci, Madame.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Madam Thomas, how many people were on the Hill and on Wellington Street at the height of the protests?
So the height of the protests were on the weekends. And we had counts of 500 to 700 rigs and 8,000 to 10,000 people.
Et si on apprenait...
And if today we were to learn that there is someone preparing, people are preparing a new protest, let's say in January, people who intend to come on the Hill, and that they would be between 5,000 and 10,000 people to come and protest, intending to come to protest here, would you recommend to the Prime Minister that he invoke the Emergency Measures Act?
No.
Pourquoi?
Why not?
Because as we saw with Rolling Thunder, which occurred here in April, May, with proper understanding of the intelligence and the information, working with the convoy or the protesters who are coming to the city, and the correct police response in conjunction with our colleagues across the national security community, the team at Intersect, the Emergency Act is not required.
And if you were to learn that among these protesters, there were some that had the intention of staying on Wellington for an extended period of several weeks, would that change your recommendation?
Again, I think different police and municipal action would ensure that people did not stay on Wellington Street. Certainly you can't get to Wellington Street in the same location any longer, but a different action would be taken ahead of time to prevent the settling in to the extent that we saw in January and February.
And if you were to learn that some of these protesters may be armed, what would you recommend to the Prime Minister?
We would recommend if there were people who were of interest to CSIS, CSIS would speak to the RCMP about that, and a police action would be taken and an RCMP investigation opened. If it is a police of jurisdiction issue, the Ottawa Police Service, I have every confidence, would respond appropriately.
And if you were to learn that the protesters had the intention of showing up with big rigs, as was the case a year ago, and close off or block off or Wellington Street or Spark Street or basically the precinct, the Hill, in one way, shape, or another, what would be your recommendation to the Prime Minister?
Before there was a recommendation to the Prime Minister, we would be working with the police to ensure that the trucks did not stay. As we saw in Montreal and Quebec and Toronto, where they did copycat convoys, when the trucks were not allowed to park, they did not have the same problem.
So, if I'm understanding you correctly, the actual source of the problem in Ottawa was the fact that police services, I'm suggesting this answer, I'm suggesting this to you, but I may be wrong. Just correct me if I'm wrong, that basically police did not do its job or incorrectly. Am I right?
Well, I'm not a policing expert, and the police are doing their own review, and the inquiry will speak to the policing aspects of this. But in cities where the trucks were not allowed to stop, they did not have the same problem.
So, if you were faced with the same situation as a national security advisor, your advice to the Prime Minister, based on or when faced with the poor strategy or the inaction of police, what would you say today?
About a future event?
Yes.
We would be very much engaged with the RCMP and Intersect and our colleagues in public safety and other departments to ensure that the proper level of response and plan was in place, just as we saw with the Rolling Thunder event in July 1st this year. So I think that the understanding of the kind of protest and protest convoy, manifestation, whatever you want to call it, that can now come and is willing to stay is differently understood, and the response would be different.
Chair, just for a bit more context, one of the successes.
I have 30 seconds left, Mr. McDonald. I'll be quick, says Mr. McDonald.
With the Rolling Thunder was in fact the role of the city and the city decisions that they take that the Ottawa police enforce. Merci.
Merci, Monsieur McDonald.
Thank you, Mr. McDonald.
Oui, merci.
Thank you.
Mr. Green?
Through you, Madam Chair, to Ms. Thomas. Ms. Thomas, you described the traditional definitions of a terror cell, of being people who are ideologically motivated, although you said foreign, kind of post 9/11, but then were controlled by people who would call the shots to people on the ground who would then carry it out. Based on the information that you would have found out today, or that you're suggesting you just found out today, would you not consider the action at Coots to be in line with the traditional definition of a terror cell?
Thank you for that question. It's a very important question, Mr. Green. I don't know enough about it at this point to answer. I only know what we've all read in the media.
But you are aware that they found significant story. And so here's the challenge that I have with the, I'm going to say the underplaying of what happened at Coots, the intention to murder RCMP officers, the stashes of weapons found, the pipe bombs. And I'll reference an interaction I had with somebody based on intelligence, because this really is about quality of intelligence and the bias that remains in policing. That there was this, a notation about ISIS as potentially being a threat without any reference to Christian dominionism, to white supremacy, to the growing militia movements that we have here. Why is it that the language of terrorism is only prescribed to people of color, to religious minorities, and yet is never rightly identified with what I deem to be one of the greatest threats in this country, quite frankly, which is ethno-nationalism and white supremacy? So put another way, given what we're hearing now, that this was a cell that was taking direction from somebody, I'll put to you in another way to give you the opportunity to perhaps revisit your answer. How does that not meet the definition of a traditional terror cell?
So I have the terrorist expert beside me, and so I'll
Okay, then
defer
let's
an
put that through.
opportunity.
No,
I
well,
agree with you.
okay, thank you. And let's allow ITAC, because this is either you know or you don't know kind of question.
Okay.
And if you don't know, given what we just found out, that's a problem.
So let me start by, so every year, many times a year, we do an assessment of the national terrorism threat level. And we
Excusez, madame, juste arrêter le thème. Est-ce que c'est possible, madame?
We're having a hard time hearing her. Could she get a bit closer to the microphone? It's very interesting what you're saying. I'm sorry.
Just to know, my time was paused at 2:18:40. Thank you.
Très bien. So, as I was saying, we do assessments regularly of the threat level for the country, and we publish an assessment. And in our last few iteration of our assessment, we did indicate that from ITAC's perspective, the most likely scenario involving a terrorism-like threat is posed by a lone actor being influenced or radicalized to violence by IMVE rhetoric. So we've identified that as the main
Correct, but
terrorism-related
with
threat.
specificity, we've
I-
watched January 6th. We've watched the rise of the Proud Boys. We've watched the mobilization of the 3%ers. I'm from Hamilton. I've been dealing with this stuff for close to a decade that I know about as a city councilor in Hamilton. And it's never referenced in any of the security reports here. The intelligence that came through was referencing ISIS, right? Like, it is absurd. And so, you know, through you, the quality of intelligence determines the outcomes of operational planning. Were you not aware that Christian dominionists and ethno-nationalists, i.e. white supremacists, were embedded within this movement and posed a threat to national security? Were you aware of that, yes or no?
So I will say that police operations, especially the type of operations that we saw at Coops, are very close hold for operational security purposes. So it's not abnormal that I would not have been privy to those details. What I can say is, as I said, and as a director of CSIS is on the record for saying, half of CSIS CT resources, counterterrorism resources, are now dedicated to IMVE.
But why do we use the term IMVE for white nationalists and
because it's
terrorists for people who aren't white nationalists?
No, actually, we moved. I use terrorism all the time because it's in the name of my organization. But when we talk about the threat, we talk about violent extremism,
Sure.
which is motivated by religion, potentially any kind of religion,
Right.
politically motivated, or ideology. And ideology is broad on purpose because they're different. There's
Yeah,
xenophobia.
Respectfully, Madam Chair, with 30 seconds left, will you acknowledge, and I think it's been put on the record publicly, that there is a threat of infiltration within our Canadian Armed Forces of ideologically motivated extremists based on white supremacy and ethno-nationalism?
I would actually have to defer that questions to the Canadian Armed Forces
Mr.
themselves.
Green, you seem like you may have an answer to that question.
I know in some of the reports we did, I think we speak to what you've said, and these have been available to you. You know, previous protests in Canada, the U.S. have seen populist, alt-right groups, white supremacists, conspiracy advocates, etc., prove adept at infiltrating, co-opting, or even taking over grievance-based protests. So, in a lot of the material that we produced around what was going on in Ottawa, I know for my part, we did not suspect that, you know, ISIS was involved. It was quite opposite what we identified.
That was from the Ottawa Police Service had that in their intelligence.
Your time is
So
up.
I think-
Bizarre. Thank
Mr.
you.
Green. Mr. Green, can you take the chair?
I certainly can. Senator Boniface, you have 5 minutes and the floor is yours.
I'm going to follow up on Mr. Green's question, and I would like you to be as brief as can, only from the perspective of when we talk about violent extremism. I would say this from a policing perspective as well, that it looks at all types of groups. And in fact, given the experience of January 6th and such like, there's concern in terms of the rise of extremism that is, as Mr. Green rightly said, a white supremacist type of operation. Am I seeing yes to that?
You're absolutely correct.
Thank you very much. I'm going to swing to a different topic then. on the role of the province. And you alluded to this, Ms. Thomas, and I want to make sure that we're very clear on what participation you got from the province, because I think it's quite clear that there was little involvement. In fact, I think the Minister of Public Safety indicated that he made attempts on a number of occasions to speak to his counterpart and was unable to do that. I spent 30 years with the province, and I'm still trying to figure out why that would be the case, given that Ottawa falls in the province of Ontario. And at the same time, I applaud the role of the Ontario Provincial Police on the final days. So I asked the question, you said you have no counterpart in the province of Ontario. Do you have a counterpart in any of the provinces?
Thank you for the question. Not doing similar roles. There are provincial security officers, but it's quite a different function.
It'd be for internal security versus
Correct.
external, like you would work on. So from this committee's perspective, would there be a benefit in terms of if you had a counterpart you could speak to who would be more on what I would consider an operational level, not on a political level, who would would that make the role easier given the types of issues that you're dealing with?
Thank you for the question. I'm not sure. Certainly the Deputy Minister of Public Safety was able to reach out to the security apparatus in the various provinces. And Mr. Di Tommaso, who is the...
I know who he is.
So he was at the inquiry. I think the fundamental problem was that Ontario determined that this was a protest in the federal capital because of a federal mandate, therefore a federal problem. And it was a much more complex issue than that. And they did not come to the table to the extent we would have appreciated because of that. Certainly at the OPP level, Inspector Creek was very engaged and very involved. You've seen evidence of that.
But I want to make it clear. I mean, the province has not only an overarching responsibility for municipalities, it's also responsible for policing in the province. So what was it your assumption that the province would play a bigger role than they did, particularly to Ottawa? And was that the same in other provinces? I'm trying to get an idea of how it compares across the country.
Thank you. It was different in each province because it depends on who the police of jurisdiction are. In
Yes.
some provinces, the RCMP are the police of jurisdiction, so it was
I'm
a different
aware, yep.
response and a different level of engagement. The most striking problem in terms of policing itself was in Ontario.
Okay. And in terms of your thoughts going forward, what changes would you make in terms of that table? We were quite interested here that the person in charge of emergency at the City of Ottawa didn't know who the Deputy Minister of Public Safety was and had never met. Given we are in the, Ottawa, isn't there a role for every level of government to protect our national capital?
Thank you. I think that's a very important observation. And so that is the point of intersect, which is all the police agencies and those of us involved in the parliamentary precinct working together to ensure we understand what the threats and the potential situations that could occur in the City of Ottawa, what they could be. The Deputy Minister of Public Safety hadn't previously been involved in that, and the new deputy and the one who just left now are. I think that there are relationships that we could say that we had not built to the extent that we should have before this convoy, because the previous manifestations and protests had been left at the OPS level, and they managed them.
Okay, thank you. Okay, we'll move to Senator Carignan to be followed by Senator Harder.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm showing you here the operational plan that was prepared by the RCMP, OPP, Ottawa Police, Toronto Police, York, and Peel Region Police. Did you see this document? You've never looked at it.
I've looked at it since. but I did not see it before
OK.
Okay, when did you take a look at it for the first time?
during the inquiry
À savoir,
That means when?
2 weeks ago.
2 weeks ago. Donc, il y a 2 semaines,
So 2 weeks ago is the first time you saw this plan.
Yes.
vous avez noté que
Did you note that it was prepared on February 12th, 2022?
Yeah. So I'd like to note that there is no expectation that I would see a tactical police plan in my job.
OK.
For one, that started to be prepared on about the 12th of February. It was not completed until the 17th of February.
OK. Mais il était si
Okay, but was signed on the 12th by all the parties.
Yes, but it was not a complete plan
OK.
with
Mais comment vous pouvez
resources.
dire que c'est pas un plan?
How can you say it's not a complete plan? You saw it 2 weeks ago.
Vous,
How can you say you saw it 2 weeks ago? You had never seen this plan ahead of time and you testified to say that it wasn't a complete plan. How can you say that?
Because it was not a complete plan with resources and an understanding of how it would be used. The complete plan was ready on the 17th of
OK. Vous
February.
avez témoigné
Okay, you testified to the fact that on February 13th you provided
the factual situation au cabinet.
a full picture of the factual situation to cabinet. How can you say that you provided a full picture of the factual situation when there's a plan prepared by police services?
C'est même pas
You didn't even know the existence of which.
So I provided the information that I was given by all the agencies involved. They all were at the table when I provided that information. That plan was not complete.
Avez-vous remarqué?
Have you noticed that they don't mention you in the plan?
I'm not a part of the policing infrastructure.
OK. Avez-vous
Have you noticed that they're referring to none of your organizations? They don't even refer to the public safety minister nor to the prime minister?
Right, because it's a policing tactical plan. We're not part of the
Alors,
policing
est-ce que c'est
infrastructure.
possible que
Is it possible that the plan might have been operational, functional, it did not require you?
I'm not sure what your question is.
la question
The question is simple. If they don't mention you in the plan, it might be because they don't need you.
I'm not a police officer. I
OK.
don't
Si
purport
je
to
vous
be.
dis
Okay, if I were to tell you that the plan as such is the plan that was applied, enforced after February 14th.
The plan that was enforced on February 17th included elements of the new authorities in the Emergencies Act.
OK. Et quel-
Okay, and what are the elements of the plan that were enforced
après le 14
after February 14th?
I can't answer that question for you. That's for the police chief.
et je comprends.
I understand why you can't answer because you didn't know.
Comment
did not know.
expliquer
How to explain that you're the advisor to the Prime Minister of Canada on national security and that you don't look out in the fields in contact with police services what they are preparing as a plan?
You've misrepresented what I've said. I reported what the RCMP told me and what the other agencies in the national security environment in this federal infrastructure reported to me. And so if there was a plan and I wasn't told, that's one thing. If there was a plan that could have been executed, then it was somebody else's responsibility. I'm not the chief of police for the federal government.
Non, mais vous conseillez le premier.
No, but you are the advisor to the Prime Minister on national security. Did you speak to Lucky, Madame Lucky from the RCMP, to say, hey, you had a plan signed by your own service and you never advised me of the fact there was a plan? Did you give her a hard time about it?
Any conversation I've had with Commissioner Lucky is private.
Et quand vous
And when you're talking about national security with the RCMP commissioner, those conversations are private. They're not of public interest.
A private conversation that I've had with her, I'm not going to discuss here. The conversations we had and the discussions we had regarding the national situation across the country are on the record. We have minutes of them all.
Moi, j'ai l'impression que
I'm getting the impression you're
dans votre tour à bureau sans qu'on
I get the feeling that you didn't go out.
I know your time is up.
That's not true.
Moving to Senator Harder.
Thank you, Chair. I was going to ask on lessons learned, but I think given the the interaction we've just had, it'd be very helpful for you to review for this committee the relationship between intelligence and security and policing and why they are separate in their mandates, but they do have touch points. Could you describe that for us
Thank you.
again?
So the principle of police independence is a fundamental in this country. I don't direct the RCMP, the OPP, or any provincial or municipal police force. We receive intelligence and information to form a threat picture. There is intelligence that is retained by the policing agencies, the RCMP being one of them, in order to execute operations such as the one in Coots. I had no expectation that I would see the tactical plan. I have no ability to assess the tactical plan. We're not policing experts. That's not what we do. We relied on the commissioner of the RCMP to ensure there was a tactical plan that could be executed, and she did that. And in fact, the plan that was put into play on or about February 17th and then through the end of the clearing of Ottawa and the convoys across the country was aptly executed, led by the RCMP and the OPP.
And could you also assure this committee that it would be inappropriate for the Prime Minister or any minister of the Crown to direct policing directly or through you?
Thank you, absolutely. And there was never a request to direct police. When Commissioner Lucky was aware of the situation in Coots, she spoke to her minister about it, as is appropriate, to tell him there was police action underway.
Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Ms. Thomas, you talked about the definition of a security threat, national security threat, and you said it requires the definition is assigned a meaning, but that it requires a broad interpretation. And as I understood it, you were saying it requires a broad interpretation beyond the definition in the Act 2C. Can you elaborate on that, please?
2C describes a situation where CSIS has an identifiable group or individual who is going to take action, and they can then collect intelligence on that individual or that group. It doesn't then allow the RCMP to take action. It means that they can, within their mandate, now act, which is generally collecting intelligence on that individual. That definition does not enable the kind of authorities that were required to end a situation such as the convoys and the blockades and the occupations that we were faced across this country in February of 2022.
Thank you. We've just been talking about policing, so I'd like to ask you about a remark you made in your opening comments that, as I understood it, that you determined the police in Ottawa could not respond. I think this was around the third weekend you were saying that. I'd just like to ask you, after 3 weeks, the police could not respond. Do you have an opinion as to whether the root cause of this situation, which, as you've explained, got out of control, was the root cause of the situation a failure of policing in the city of Ottawa?
Thank you for that question. As I've said, I'm not a policing expert. I think that there is an underestimation of the intention of the people who came to Ottawa. It was seen more as a traditional protest, which Ottawa Police Service managed constantly. And so the situation rapidly, and Chief Slowly said from the Saturday of the first weekend, it became beyond the capacity of the Ottawa Police Service. And immediately we saw impacts on the city of Ottawa. The Rideau Centre closed that Saturday. And so it was from the first weekend different than anything that had been experienced. It took some time to understand how large it was, how embedded it was, how entrenched it was, what the logistics supply chains were, how much money was fueling it, which allowed people to stay. And that we were not able to use existing authorities, or the existing authorities were not used in order to resolve the problem. And while Ottawa was the biggest, I do repeat that this was a national crisis. There were instances across the country.
You, in your testimony, have said that there have been developed better relations between your office and others as a result of this experience with the convoy. Could you tell us if there are any other, I guess, lessons learned or new practices that have resulted from this experience?
Thank you for that question. I think there are some lessons yet learned, but yet to be executed on. That is understanding the open source intelligence problem that I spoke about earlier. I think, and this is something that the clerk of the Privy Council said to us frequently, police, national security people, we see things like convoys and protests all the time. This was different. And I think it goes to Mr. Green's point, if I may, that we underestimate and underestimated, probably no longer, the ideologically motivated extremists. And this problem exists in Canada, and it is here to stay. And we need to understand what it is and have the tools to do something about it.
That's the end of your time, Senator Patterson. Thank you very much. May I take this opportunity to thank our guests for joining us? I know it's been a long 2 hours, but we're grateful for your appearance before us, and we thank you all for coming. Colleagues, it'll be about a 7-minute break so that we can bring in our next witness by video conference. Thank you.
What's going on, guys? I just missed that last part. You guys are going to have to fill me in. I was under the impression that this was ending, and then I just heard her say that it's going to be 7 minutes. Sorry, guys, I had to turn the TV off there for a second. I was watching on there while I was getting some clipping done on my phone. There was actually some good things brought out in this. I'm glad we tuned in. I'm just reading what Phil said. What's up, Phil? Someone else is on Zoom? All right, well, we'll stay tuned in. What did she say? I wrote it down. That was pretty good. Oh, that's interesting. So Trudeau's national security advisor, who went above and beyond the confines of the law, who went above Emergencies Act Section 2, which is the only reason you can invoke the Emergency Measures Act, didn't even see the plan that the police had, that the Liberal cabinet was briefed on before they invoked the Emergency Measures Act. She didn't even see it. And then after the plan was invoked, she didn't even look into it. She didn't even see it until the Public Order Emergency Commission 2 weeks ago. These people are insane. And they should be in a lot of trouble. As much as a lot of people are getting frustrated with this, as I am myself, all of this shit is being put on the record. And then to hear Matthew Green go on, holy smokes, the Canadian Armed Forces are white, you know what? Like, dude, are you out of your mind? Like, literally just smear Canadian veterans. Like they haven't been kicked enough while they're down. What a joke. What a label to just throw. Oh yeah, the Canadian Armed Forces has been infiltrated by white nationalists and garbage. Unbelievable. Yeah, I was under the impression that this was going on for 2 hours. I didn't think they'd be going over at all. They don't normally. But we're going to keep an eye on this. We're going to keep an eye on this special joint committee. I was just writing a bunch of shit down and clipping some of this to send to the legal team over at Freedom Corp because I know those guys are busy. You know, some of this stuff is relevant, and when you go from the Public Order Commission and now we're going to the Joint Committee on the Declaration of Emergency, some things that are being said are different than the things that were said during the commission. So the more of these people actually finally talk, we're getting conflicting information, which is going to, in a democratic country, hurt the witnesses who testified at the commission if Justice Rouleau is watching this like he should be. But I don't know if I got high hopes on that. Not very smart for intelligence. All they had to do was look down the roads and overpasses at the thousands and thousands of supporters. I agree with you, Doreen. If the anti-white rhetoric inks you out at all, you should check out No White Guilt on YouTube. I will check that out when I have time. Oh, Phil says they're going back to the Diagolon narrative. Yeah, they're trying to hang on to that. They're trying to paint whatever picture they want to do.
We're joined by Jacob Wells.
All right, we'll see what this is, guys. Back
Mr.
shortly.
Wells, thank you for joining us. As a
you for
reminder,
having me.
translation is available through the global icon at the bottom of your screen. You will have 5 minutes for opening comments if you wish to add anything. I know you provided us with a document.
Sure.
Thank
Go
you.
ahead.
Good evening, and thank you to the chair
point
and
d'ordre.
committee members
Point d'ordre.
for inviting me.
Point of order. Madam Chair, were the audio tests done with the witness prior to the witness appearing?
Et est-ce que les...
And were they satisfactory?
Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
I'm sorry, sir. Go ahead.
All right, thank you. Good evening, and thank you to the chair and committee members for inviting me to speak. My name is Jacob Wells, and I am a co-founder of the crowdfunding platform GiveSendGo.com. I'm humbled by the opportunity to participate in these proceedings and pleased to answer any relevant questions you have regarding the campaigns on GiveSendGo. I'm amazed to see the growth of GiveSendGo since its inception 8 years ago. It was established with one simple mission, which is to share the hope of Jesus through crowdfunding. It's my honor to be able to share that same hope with you today. Our goal was to create a fundraising platform that brought the utility of online fundraising to the truth that life consists of more than just money in the material world. Again, our mission is to share the hope of Jesus through crowdfunding. Some of the ways in which we achieve this is by calling and praying with our campaign owners and sharing the hope we have through the messaging on our platform and our correspondence with our givers and other users. Over the past 8 years, GiveSendGo has become a leader in the online fundraising space and is now available in over 80 countries. Through our platform, millions of dollars are raised annually to help meet the needs of people and organizations in fulfilling their missions. Though much of what we will be discussing this evening revolves around a domestic humanitarian campaign that became politicized and international, the vast majority of campaigns on GiveSendGo are created by individuals raising money to meet needs such as medical bills, tragedies, and mission trips. One of the distinctions between GiveSendGo and other crowdfunding platforms is that GiveSendGo views itself as a service that allows the raising of funds for legal activities without discrimination. I, as a veteran of the United States Navy, and we as a company value freedom, and the sacrifice is paid for us to live in that freedom, even on matters that we may not personally agree with, but are legal by the laws of our governments. So rather than make decisions about what types of legal activities we will host, GiveSendGo has largely chosen to allow the law to determine those boundaries. I want to be very clear, we do have a verification team that does due diligence to ensure goals that are stated in campaigns that we host are legal endeavors, and that the recipients of the funds raised are identified and verified to use online payment services. As our payment processor does the same, we feel campaigns on our platform are vetted thoroughly before any funds are dispersed. We then rely on the existing law enforcement agencies to do their job in investigating and enforcing any laws that are violated. With that being said, I welcome your questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Wells. We'll begin our 5-minute round, starting with Mr. Brock.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and good evening, Mr. Wells. Thank you for your appearance tonight.
Good evening. Thank you.
So I have a few questions to ask of you for the next 5 minutes or so. And I want to start by highlighting what I deem to be the most important feature which distinguishes your crowdsourcing funding operation from your competitors, particularly GoFundMe. And that is, you believe in the value of freedom. Would that be a fair statement? Summarize it succinctly?
That is very correct.
And you were aware fairly early on that GoFundMe was initially involved in the Freedom Convoy movement before your organization, and subsequently withdrew their support. You were aware of that?
We were.
And I understand because we questioned at great length the representative, which was the legal representative of GoFundMe, that they actively were engaged in dialogue with the Ottawa Police Service. Can the same be said for your organization during those early days leading up to police involvement, which disbanded the movement entirely?
We were not involved with any police force in Ottawa or Ontario. We were not contacted by any and didn't reciprocate. We didn't have any contact.
Within 6 days of the arrival of the convoy, Freedom Convoy in Ottawa on the 28th of January, we have GoFundMe on record on the 2nd of February, many days before they canceled their service, that they were, quote, invested in assisting the police in ending the funding. Did you ever take that approach with respect to the Freedom Convoy?
No, we did not.
Were you ever contacted by any federal government official to discontinue your support for the Freedom Convoy?
No, we were not.
And I know this may be a question that you will get from other members of this committee, so I thought I would deal with it right from the get-go. I understand that there were two sources of crowdfunding that were affiliated with your company. One was the Adopt a Trucker crowdfunding, and the other one was the Freedom Convoy 2022 donations. Is that accurate?
That is correct.
And of the Adopt a Trucker crowdfunding, am I correct with these numbers that according to your company, a total of just under $600,000 US was raised?
That sounds correct.
And the majority of that, to the tune of 55%, came from our host country, Canada, correct?
From a value percentage, it was 59%.
Correct. And roughly 41% originated from the United States?
I believe it's 37% value-wise.
Okay. And from other countries, just under 20,000. Would that be accurate?
That sounds about right.
Of the other country contributions, do you have a number with respect to the Federation of Russia?
I do not believe that we noticed any donations coming from Russia. In looking at it, I didn't notice any. It is something that I can go back and provide for you if there is, but I don't believe there is any.
Were you aware that politicians in our country, as well as our national taxpayer-funded media, the CBC, had broadcasted that there were Russian influences with respect to this convoy and money coming from that country? Were you aware of that?
I believe I became aware of that later after the fact. It is something that I recall, but I don't believe at that moment I knew that.
Okay. Now, with respect to the Freedom Convoy donations, I understand that there were a total of just over 113,000 donors.
That's correct.
Just under 40,000 donations from Canada.
That is probably, yeah, that's correct.
Okay, and I'm out of time, so I'm sure that one of my colleagues will pick up the narrative on that point. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Brock. Moving to, excuse me, Mr. Varani.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Thank you, Mr. Wells, for rejoining us. So I'm going to pick up where you had indicated to Mr. Brock that you were aware that GoFundMe had stopped giving the Freedom Convoy protesters in Canada money, and you stepped into the breach. That's correct?
That's correct.
And GoFundMe stopped giving the Freedom Convoy protesters money because they had deemed that their actions were no longer peaceful, but they said that they'd become an occupation. So you stepped into that fundraising void. Is that correct? Are you aware of that?
I wasn't sure the terminology that GoFundMe used. We don't take our policy from GoFundMe. And the convoy approached us. So campaigns come to our platform of their own volition all the time.
Okay, and you said that you had a verification team that, and you always have a verification team for your campaign.
There was a lot of elements involved. Give, Send, Go took this as an opportunity itself as a business, and we advanced our platform as a result of it. But the campaign, the funds that were coming from that campaign in particular, were coming here to the U.S. And so, as accounts go and court orders go, there's jurisdictional issues, and jurisdiction was abided by according to the jurisdictions of where funds were. So
Actually, the evidence we've heard at this committee actually indicates quite the opposite, that the money would go from Give, Send, Go to a Canadian bank, then to individual blockader, and it was the Canadian banks that accepted the authority and the jurisdiction of that decision. It wasn't Give, Send, Go at all. Do you have any response to that?
The funds for that campaign were coming to the United States. They weren't going to representative in Canada. And so the funds were being held here in the United States, which was outside of the jurisdiction of the Canadian court.
Right, and that explains your tweet. But ultimately, when the funds get released, I'm not talking about the donation of the funds, I'm talking about the release of the funds. When the funds get released, they go via a Canadian bank to an individual. But I guess my question to you is that, were you at all concerned, if you weren't concerned about the impact on the Canadian economy, were you concerned about the fact that auto industry shift workers were being stopped, shifts were being closed in places like Kentucky, Tennessee, Michigan, Ohio? Did you have any sense of the impact of your funding of these illegal blockades on the American economy?
Well, there was no impact of the fundraising campaigns because the funds never reached the convoy. So to say that there was an impact would be a misstatement because they never reached the convoy to have an impact.
Okay, Mr. Ronnie, your time is up. We'll move to Mr. Fartan. You have 5 minutes.
Merci.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Wells, you were saying rather, in response to Mr. Brock's questions, you were reading some statistics, a breakdown actually, of the funds that you collected and that were transferred. What exactly is in that document, those statistics? What information do you have in that document?
Est-ce que vous entendez ma question, monsieur?
Can you hear my question, Mr. Wells?
I didn't get a translation on that.
Madame la Présidente, j'aimerais que mon...
Madam Chair, I'd ask that my time be set back to 0. The interpreter is working right now. I'm not sure why.
Confirm that on your Zoom screen on the bottom, you have a globe that says interpretation. And then if you choose that interpretation, you can choose the English translation to make sure you're getting English translation.
I just did that. Thank you.
This is the interpreter. This is the interpreter. Can you hear us, Mr. Wells?
OK, merci. Alors, je...
Okay, thank you. So let me start again. I'll hopefully reset. Mr. Wells, earlier on, in response to Mr. Brock's questions, you were reading a document that seemed to be a bit of a breakdown of the various amounts received, where they came from. You were providing percentages and amounts. I'd like you to specify what information is on that document.
The information on that document is exactly that, just a breakdown of the number of givers, the percentage of the number of givers from each country. The primary countries, Canada and the US, and then all others. From a individual standpoint, a number of donors, and then a value standpoint.
Okay. Can you give us a copy of that document, Mr. Wells?
I can have one submitted to you.
Merci.
Thank you. Madam Clerk, or the clerks will be able to contact you for you to be able to share those with us. That said, Mr. Wells, I believe I understood from your testimony that you were never in touch with any police officers at any point with respect to the Freedom Convoy operations, correct?
That's correct.
And if police officers had contacted you or representatives of the government had contacted you to ask for information on the sources of funding, the amounts, would you have cooperated with the authorities on that question?
We most definitely would have.
Est-ce que vous êtes...
Were you aware of movements that could only be qualified as terrorist movements aiming to overthrow the government in the context of the fundraising operation that you were responsible for at Give, Send, Go?
No, we were not aware of anything like that.
Donc, si je comprends...
So from what I gather, the funds that you collected came partly from the US, partly from Canada, and for a small percentage of those funds from other states, and it was mostly from people who intended. It was from people who wanted to contribute to the convoy, the Freedom Convoy, because the convoy claimed that it was in favor of individual freedoms, and that was the only reason why those people were contributing to your campaign, Give, Send, Go. Correct?
Yes, that's correct.
Et si...
And had you known that some activities of the Freedom Convoy aimed at an overthrow of the government or the idea of launching terrorist operations in Canada, what would you have done?
If there was any evidence of any illegal activity being committed by the receivers of the funds, we would have shut it down.
Merci, Mr. Wells.
Thank you, Mr. Wells.
Okay, we'll move to Mr. Green.
Thank you very much. Mr. Wells, in your opening statements, you referenced that the simple mission of Give, Send, Go is to share the hope of Jesus through crowdfunding. Do you consider your organization or your company to be a Christian organization?
We do.
Do you have any nonprofit entities or faith-based groups attached to your company?
We recently started Give, Send, Go charities.
And is that through a faith-based charitable number through the IRS, or is that through a nonprofit just registered to your company as a corporation?
Currently, it's through a faith-based, but it's becoming through a nonprofit organization.
So currently you receive tax exemptions based on the faith-based nature of your charitable wing of your corporation?
Correct.
Okay. And we also understood in your mission that you were kind of a champion for free speech. And in your testimony on March 3rd in front of SECU, there was an exchange with Ms. Pam Damoff that talked about the Ku Klux Klan. And I want to give you the opportunity to use your free speech and clarify whether or not you support the Ku Klux Klan in any way,
Right. Thank you. No, I absolutely abhor what the Ku Klux Klan and any supremacy organization
Would that
stand
also include the Proud Boys?
for. Would that include the Proud Boys? I'm not overly familiar with what their doctrine.
Have they ever
I guess,
used your
was,
platform
like-
to raise funds, the Proud Boys of the United States of America?
Yeah, some Proud Boys have, yes.
Are you aware that the Proud Boys is listed as a terrorist entity in Canada, sir?
I have become aware of that, yes.
Were you aware of that through your due diligence process? When you were
Yes.
looking at possible links between the terrorist entity listed here in Canada and perhaps involvement with the convoy?
What we do in our verification process is we vet the people that are receiving the funds, not
How do
the
you do that?
10,000 people that's through the systems already in place of terror watch lists, people on
So you
people
would
of
have known
interest.
that if anybody was listed as a Proud Boy and might have had some interest in this, that you're stating that you would have had systems in place to ensure that was the case?
That's correct.
Okay.
We verify the receivers of funds.
And so knowing that they're a terrorist entity, would you continue to platform Proud Boys?
Not in Canada.
But you in the United States?
They're not considered a terrorist organization in the United States.
Okay. And so when you use your simple mission to share the hope of Jesus through crowdfunding in your testimony, following the attack on the U.S. Capitol, is that correct?
That's incorrect.
That's it. So you did not raise any money for people involved in the United States Capitol attack?
Not that I'm aware of. We had fundraisers prior to January 6th for people going to a rally in Washington, D.C. That
And-
was the extent of those campaigns to get airfare and lodging in D.C. on the days for the rally that was happening on January 6th.
And would
Yes.
would you classify that, knowing what you know now, given all the hearings that have happened, would you classify that as a rally, sir? Was that a lawful rally which resulted in the murder of a police officer, a Capitol Hill police officer? Was that a lawful rally in your opinion?
Well, it sounds like you're stating misinformation.
Was an officer not murdered? I'm sorry, sir. I'm not from the United
No.
States. Was an officer not
No.
murdered on the Capitol?
Not to my understanding, no.
Well, perhaps we have better access to your media than you do, sir. The Canadian convoy protest, another controversial entity that you've picked up. What I'm suggesting here, sir, is there's a bit of a theme with some of the activities that you're involved in that tiptoe around a gray area, and I'm just wondering how you profit from that. So I'm wondering, in terms of I'm seeing that I'm out of time. I'll come back to the witness at the appropriate time. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Green. Thanks for understanding. Can you take the chair, Mr. Green?
Certainly can. You have 5 minutes.
Thank you very much.
Madame la Présidente, on me dit.
Madam Chair, I'm hearing that there's an issue with the interpretation. Is that everything okay for the interpreter?
It sounds good on my end. Interpretation, c'est bon? Bon travail?
Ah, OK. Oui, c'était le débit qui était trop rapide. Désolé.
It's a matter of speed.
Je m'excuse. Okay, Senator Boniface, you have 5 minutes. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and thank you for appearing with us today. I'd like to understand in a little more detail the verification process. I'm not as familiar with your platform, so just what you call verification, maybe what I call verification might be different. So can you walk me through that?
Sure. Thank you for the question. When somebody comes on to Give, Send, Go, prior to going through a process called KYC, Know Your Customer, which is a regulatory process of identifying who the person is that is receiving funds. We allow campaigns to begin receiving funds. Prior to them receiving those funds, they go through a process of becoming identified through a social security number, a license, some form of identification, and that's matched against all sorts of databases to make sure that they're not on a list or not able to use the financial systems that are in place. If they're flagged because they are on one of those lists, then they're not able to receive those funds. And in partnership with that, we read through the campaign and what the campaign is requesting funds for. And we ensure that it adheres to the laws of the land, that they're not doing things that are illegal. They're not trying to raise money to go murder somebody or do something illegal. So we ensure that what their ask is a legitimate ask.
Okay, so in this case, would you be looking at the laws of the land, as you say, in Canada? Or are you
Correct.
talking about it in the US because that's where you are?
So when people on board from foreign countries, they go through that same process that's required of that country for them to be able to access the financial system. So everybody that comes on board in Canada goes through the process of being verified in Canada according to Canadian standards of being able to access the financial system. And that's how we vet people.
Okay, so you say social insurance or social security number. So would you have those access to those numbers in Canada? How do you verify that?
That information is submitted through our payment solution and into a database. We don't hold those numbers personally ourselves, but it goes into a database and the identity is verified by the input of that information and also an ID, some sort of government issued identification. And with the conjunction of those things and the information provided, we can validate and verify the person receiving the funds.
Okay. And can you just tell us currently what the state of the 10 million in fundraising accomplished on your platform through donations? Where is it at?
So the vast majority of those funds were refunded because they couldn't accomplish the ends of that the givers intended for. So they were refunded, I believe, in mid-March, and back to the givers. And a percentage of those funds had been transferred to a Canadian account. Chad Eros, who was the treasurer for the Freedom Convoy organization, and those funds have been put in escrow, I believe, pending litigation, various things.
Okay. And in terms of the program Adopt a Trucker, just help me understand what was the purpose? Like, how do you sell that to somebody?
Well, Give, Send, Go itself doesn't. Campaign owners set up campaigns. They come on and they begin a fundraising effort, and they tell people what they're fundraising for. And in that case, I believe it was someone who was raising funds for to provide for displaced families of truckers who were put out of work because of the mandates that had been enacted and things of that nature.
So not in your mind, at least when you assess that connected to what here we determine is, some of us determine is a blockades that were interrupting the economy of the country. You wouldn't do any work or effort around that to make sure that connection wasn't taking place.
What we look at is what the campaign owner has stated, what they're fundraising for, and we say, is that a legal objective? And if it's a legal objective, if they were to take their money, just like anyone, if they were to get money from their job and go do something illegal with the money that they've earned, that's illegal, and there's law enforcement procedures to go after people that do illegal activity.
Okay,
So
I'll have to stop you, Mr. Wells, because I'm getting the sign that I'm out of time. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Green. We'll go back in our list to Senator Carignan, 5 minutes.
Merci.
Thank you. I really only have one question. Is it legal in nature to have funding between countries in this way? In other words, that Canadians could be involved in financing for activities in the US or the other way around, the US and Canada? Is that illegal in nature?
No, that isn't. It happens quite often.
OK.
Okay. Thank you.
J'ai pas d'autres questions.
I have no further questions.
Mr. Harder, you have 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And Mr. Wells, were you aware that that at least the document from early on in the convoy articulated their desire to come to Ottawa and overthrow the government and have the Senate of Canada go to the Governor General and form a new government? In your view, is that sedition and overthrow of a government a legal act that would express the sharing the hope of Jesus?
Well, what campaign owners do as a fundraising effort, we don't say is necessarily sharing the hope of Jesus. What we do in our engagement with those campaign owners, we say is sharing the hope of Jesus. And there's definitely a distinction there. But as to the question about that memorandum or what you're suggesting, the parties that were involved in the fundraising piece made no reference to that, actually disavowed.
So you
anything
really
like
don't,
that.
you really don't vet your prospective clients. You take them at their word, and if they were to pursue illegal activities with those funds, you would simply say, well, that's not what they told us. So there is no vetting process.
Well, there is a vetting process because currently, if you are a terrorist or if you are a person of interest, you're placed on lists. If you've defrauded banks and you've been added to lists and you're not able to avail yourself of the financial infrastructure. So when you're vetted as a person that is able to access banking infrastructure, and you haven't broken laws that would disavail you of those things. And
no, but if your intent was, you would at least until, as I understand it, you were happy to fund the January 6th group going to Washington, and oh gosh, we were surprised that they then were involved in events that led to the murder of at least one policeman.
Well, again, I don't know of any murder of any police officer, but the reality, I guess, in free societies is, I mean, we can get into the idea of thought crime, like we're going to prejudge what people do. Typically, when people come, and this is what we find to be the case, and they state what they're doing and make a lawful claim and make claims to it, and it's authorized. I mean,
Mr. Wells, how many other fundraising activities are presently involving Canadian organizations?
We have hundreds, we have thousands and thousands of campaigns on Give, Send, Go.
In Canada?
There's probably hundreds of campaigns in Canada that are active right now. Like I opened, the vast majority of them are for medical bills, for people helping people in their community. In response to the Freedom Convoy 2022, this was an Ontario sanctioned incorporated not-for-profit that came to Give, Send, Go to fundraise. We have the incorporation documents from the province of Ontario incorporating them.
Are you aware that as a result of or consequent to the emergency, legal changes have been enacted that now require online crowdfunding platforms to report large or suspicious transactions to the Financial Transactions and Report Analysis Center here in Canada? And if so, how has that affected your business? And if not, would you please review this as to how it should change your business?
Thank you for the question. Yeah, we're constantly updating our platform and our processes to include new laws and regulations, and we're working with our payment providers to do those very things
And
in
has that
Canada
been
and
done?
around the world. It's in the process. There's a process to
Well,
incorporating those things.
we're almost a year into that. When will this process end where you can assure us that that you are now compliant?
I believe we are compliant. We're in review right now with our payment providers on the status of those things. So I believe we've done what we need to do at this time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We'll move to Senator Patterson.
I'll pass, Madam Chair. Thank you.
Okay, we'll move to second round, 4 minutes, starting with Mr. Brock.
I have no questions. Thank you.
Okay. 4 minutes, Ms. Van Duyn.
Thank you for being here, Mr. Wells. You indicated in your opening that your mission is to share the hope of Jesus with your platform. You answered a number of questions about this already. I'm just wondering specifically with respect to this fundraising campaign, what is the connection between the hope of Jesus and the aims of this particular movement?
Thank you for your question. Again, like I stated earlier, the intention of a campaign might not necessarily align itself to our mission, which is to share the hope that we have with people. So when we get a campaign and call them to tell them about Jesus or to pray with them, that's what we do, and that's how we do it.
And you mentioned earlier that you believe in freedom. Do you believe in the freedom of movement of people, that I should be able to move freely?
Yes, I do believe that.
And you were aware, of course, it was part of international headlines that this movement, this blockade, was actually blocking an international border between our two countries, the United States and Canada.
I actually believe it was the Canadian government that enacted some laws restricting the movement of unvaccinated people. So I thought that was what you were referring to, but the Freedom Convoy that set up a campaign on Give, Send, Go was actually disavowed the blockades that were happening at the border. They were specific to what was going on in Ottawa. So our campaigns, to our knowledge, had nothing to do with the blockades that were happening at the borders.
Well, in Ottawa, even if that is your contention, ambulances were unable to bring patients to the emergency room due to the roads being blocked. And I understand that the truckers that were blocking those roads were really funded by your campaign. Were you not aware that the movement of people in Ottawa was completely the freedom of movement was not respected here in Ottawa, and that is also a freedom. I guess I would ask also, sir, if you honor and respect veterans, because as you may or may not know, on January 29th, quite early on in the blockade, members of the protest desecrated our war memorial. Were you aware of that?
I was not aware of that. Have not been aware of that. I think I've stated this several times, but it's worth repeating. Or maybe I actually haven't. That this group of people that came to Ottawa was a very diverse group. That, from our opinion and look at it, that were not being controlled by anybody. It was largely independent operators that were coming of their own volition.
Mr. Wells, you're coming to the committee stating that you did not know what this protest or this blockade was about. The New York Times has published extensively at the time about what was going on. If you watch Fox Business covered what was going on at the time, CNN as well. Are you telling us that you had no idea that this was going on in Canada and that your platform was supporting it?
No, that's not what I'm saying at all. What I'm saying is,
so you were aware.
The idea that because some people show up and do something bad at an event makes the whole event bad that's a logical fallacy. And that's the fallacy that you're trying to present. It's not the case that if at a rock concert, some people get in a fight, that somehow the rock concert is illegal. The people that organized the campaign on Give, Send, Go made explicit statements that they were against violence, that their fundraising effort was for specific means.
And did you verify that that was indeed the case, that that
Point
was
of
what was
order,
going on the
Madam
ground?
Chair, maybe she can let
Point of
the,
order.
let the witness answer the questions.
We did verify that, and that's part of our verification process, is who the individuals are that are receiving the funds, what
Mr.
their
Wells,
attest.
Mr. Wells, I'm sorry, the time is up for that question. So I know it's difficult when you're not here. We'll move to Mr. Fortin to be followed by Mr. Green. And you each have 3 minutes.
Monsieur Wells.
Mr. Wells, can you just confirm again, after everything that's just been said, you were never contacted by any Canadian police service, whether it's the municipal level police or any other police from Canada? No police contacted you regarding the funding of the Freedom Convoy?
Yes, I want to make that very clear that that never happened, but also that the Freedom Convoy Corporation was also a corporation that was authorized by the state, the province of Ontario.
Et l'autre question.
And the other and final question that I have, are you also, by that measure, confirming that you were never contacted by authorities, in other words, a government representative or the government from Ontario, federal government, or any municipal government from the city of Ottawa never contacted you?
That's correct.
Merci.
Thank you, Mr. Wells.
Mr. Green.
Just want to close the loop on that particular line of questioning. In the months after the occupation, have you been in contact with any government officials or political entities, political parties, for any conversations related to your involvement in the convoy?
We have been interviewed by the commission.
Okay,
The
just the
independent
commission, no other political actors?
Not to my knowledge.
Okay. Now, going back to your charity, sir, is your charity funded by the gift portions of your platform?
No, it's not. Well, actually, I guess it depends on what you mean by gift portion. On
I
our
understand you
platform.
receive tips. Does a portion of the
that's-
tips go to your charitable donations?
We fund the Give, Send, Go as a for-profit business. We operate on the revenue generated by tips. We cover the costs of the charity, so that any money that the charity does raise and disperse, it 100% goes to the need that's arisen.
Okay. But in terms of your charitable aspect, your testimony today is that it's funded through some of the tips. And I want to reference the March 2022 Time Magazine article that suggested and reported that Give, Send, Go received more than $640,000 in gift donations from supporters of the Freedom Convoy and the Adopt a Trucker campaign. And I want to make sure I understand it correctly, that the gift portion, the $640,000, was something that you received. Is that correct?
That sounds about right.
So in other words, you raised $600,000 for the cause and $640,000 for your own organization. Is that correct?
The total amount raised was approximately 13 million Canadian, and I think we received around that $600,000 in tips.
So in other words, you're an organization called Give, Send, Go that from, the lists of your various clients, profits off of organizations that effectively have been cut off from other mainstream legitimate online platforms. Is it the case that you're the online platform of last resort and part of, that seems like a really high amount of money to be raising off of a charitable donation?
Well, it's voluntary, so people do it of their own volition.
Was that gift from an individual, or is that across the board? What was the highest amount of the gift that you would have received for Give, Send, Go from an individual?
So the average donation to the campaign was around $100, and the average additional donation to Give Send Go might have been around $5.
What was the highest gift to Give Send Go?
I'm not aware of
You're
that.
not aware of that. And so essentially, out of the $640,000, how much of that might have ended up in your charity?
Very little of it. We don't fund the charity. Currently, the charity raises its own funds.
Thank you.
For
That's
various
the extent
causes.
of my questions. My time's up.
I'm just checking our senators, no further questions. Okay, given that, Mr. Wells, your testimony is finished and we want to thank you for appearing, particularly for coming back the second time when you had difficulties in your first time of being here. So we're grateful to you being here.
Order.
Okay.
I just want to let Mr. Wells know that the police officer's name who died at Capitol Hill was Brian Sicknick, who was 42 years old. Thank you.
Yes, he died 2 days later from a stroke. I understand that.
Anyways, Mr. Wells,
And he said
thank
that
you for
nobody died.
appearing with us, and colleagues, we are now adjourned.
All right, guys. Well, that wraps that up for tonight. Yeah, gong show to say the least. That was a trip, eh? Can you imagine being that dude from Give Send Go? Like being an American and coming on and needing to listen to these Canadian politics. Like, I know America's not in the best shape, right? Like, we all know that. But compared to Canada, like, oh my God, this guy's like, they're trying to nail him. Like, hey, you have a charity. The money that's coming in, you don't track where it's coming from. Like, no, like people normally need surgeries or like have cancer, and people are usually raising money through the community. Like, why the hell would I be looking into those people? Why would I infringe on their rights and look into them? He must just be sitting there like, this is an absolute fucking Canadian clown show. And that's what we got going on over here in Canada, brother. Canada considers the Proud Boys terrorists? Like, holy smokes. What a joke. That's because if you speak out against the state, you're an enemy of the state, which means you've done nothing wrong. So they'll find a way to turn you into a criminal by putting in new legislations, by bringing forth new laws, by censoring speech. All right, guys. Well, thanks for jumping on here. That was interesting to watch. And I think we'll keep our eye on it. The next one's next week on Thursdays. So If you guys aren't already following me, give me a like and subscribe, share this out, and we'll jump on next week and we'll cover that one too. All right, guys, you have a great weekend.